In the quiet heart of ancient Greece, sometime around 360 BCE, an aging philosopher sat beneath the colonnades of his academy. His name was Plato, the student of Socrates, the teacher of Aristotle, and one of the minds that shaped the foundation of Western thought. The air around him carried the murmur of olive trees, the soft hum of Athens at dusk, and the slow rhythm of questions that had no simple answers. Here, amid discussions of virtue, order, and the nature of reality, Plato began to speak of a world that once was, or perhaps never had been at all. He called it Atlantis. In his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, written near the end of his life, Plato described a mighty island empire beyond the Pillars of Heracles, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. It was a place of abundance, gleaming temples, and perfect geometry. Its kings descended from gods. Its people mastered the sea, ruled vast lands, and built cities that shimmered like reflections of the heavens themselves. Yet, for all their greatness, they grew proud, and in their pride, they turned against the divine order. And so, the story tells, the gods struck them down. In a single day and night of misfortune, the island of Atlantis was swallowed by the sea. To a modern listener, this might sound like myth, a story meant to enchant, or a fable to frighten. But in Plato's time, stories were never just stories. They were instruments of teaching, mirrors held up to human nature. The dialogue that introduces Atlantis is not a tale of fantasy, but of philosophy in disguise. In Timaeus, Plato sought to explain the creation of the world, not through divine revelation, but through harmony and reason. He envisioned a universe built by a divine craftsman, the demiurge, who shaped order out of chaos. Within that framework, Atlantis appears as a parallel to his ideal city, a counterpart to Athens, his moral experiment in motion. Atlantis represents what happens when knowledge, power, and ambition grow without restraint. It was not a prophecy, nor a history lesson. It was a mirror. Through Plato's allegory, we glimpse the timeless tension between virtue and ambition, how even the most enlightened societies risk collapse when they forget their moral balance. The fall of Atlantis is not the punishment of a god, but the echo of human choice. In the candle-lit halls of the academy, students would have gathered as Plato read his words aloud, the tone more meditative than dramatic. Athens had seen its own rise and fall, from the glory of Pericles to the scars of the Peloponnesian War. The empire that once ruled the Aegean had been humbled by conflict and excess. To those who listened, the lost island across the Western Sea was more than metaphor. It was memory. Plato attributes the story to Solon, the legendary Athenian lawgiver who, he claims, heard it from Egyptian priests in the city of Sais. These priests, he writes, told of an ancient power that once tried to conquer the world, but was defeated by a noble and virtuous Athens. It is here that myth, memory, and morality converge, a philosophical parable wearing the mask of legend. Some scholars believe Plato invented Atlantis entirely, as a literary device to contrast the perfect state of the Republic with the corrupted splendor of an imagined empire. Others have wondered if he drew from older flood myths or distant echoes of Bronze Age catastrophes, the fall of Minoan Crete, perhaps, or the eruption of Thera. Through this gentle uncertainty, we see another truth, that myths survive not because they are factual, but because they speak to something enduring in the human spirit. Atlantis, whether real or imagined, captures our longing for balance between power and peace, knowledge and humility, civilization and nature. As Plato's dialogues continued, he never finished the tale. Critias, the second part, ends abruptly, mid-sentence. Scholars still debate why. Did he intend to write more and never return to it? Or was the silence deliberate, a quiet invitation for future minds to finish the thought themselves? Perhaps it was always meant to fade, just as the city itself did, sinking not into the sea, but into the depths of time and imagination. By the time of Plato's death, the story of Atlantis was already spreading beyond the academy. Other philosophers mentioned it briefly, most regarded it as allegory. Yet it lingered, like a whisper at the edge of reason, too poetic to dismiss, too mysterious to forget. The Greeks were seafarers. They looked to the horizon and wondered what lay beyond. In that wondering, Atlantis lived. And here lies one of history's quiet marvels, that a single conversation, written on papyrus more than 2,000 years ago, would ripple outward across continents and centuries, inspiring explorers, dreamers, and thinkers to search for a world that may have never existed. Even now, when we read Plato's words, we hear more than philosophy. We hear the voice of an old man reflecting on civilization itself, on what it means to rise, to fall, and to be remembered. Atlantis, as Plato conceived it, was never truly lost. It was a reflection of ourselves, our achievements, and our vulnerabilities mirrored upon the surface of the sea. Through his calm, deliberate words, Plato gifted us not a place, but a question. What happens when a society becomes so powerful that it forgets its purpose? The answer, perhaps, lies not beneath the ocean, but in the quiet chambers of human conscience. As the tides of time carried his story forward, it began to drift away from philosophy into legend. And those centuries would pass before the world spoke of Atlantis again. Plato's dream continued to move through history, like a gentle current beneath the waves. As Plato's words echoed through centuries, they began to take on a life of their own, drifting beyond philosophy into legend. Long before Plato gave voice to Atlantis, the world he lived in was already steeped in older stories. Fragments of memory passed through generations of sailors, priests, and poets. The Mediterranean, calm in appearance but ancient in soul, carried more than trade between its shores. It carried memory itself. When Plato wrote that Solon had heard of Atlantis from Egyptian priests, he was not inventing this detail at random. Egypt, in the Greek imagination, was the keeper of lost wisdom, a land where time ran deeper than anywhere else, where temples bore inscriptions older than myth. To claim Egyptian origin for a story was to give it gravity. It rooted the tale in the soil of civilization itself. In the Egyptian city of Sais, Plato tells us, the priests spoke of a time 9,000 years before Solon, when the world was young and balance between gods and mortals was still pure. They spoke of a great empire beyond the sea, and of Athens, then a virtuous and heroic city that had stood against its aggression. To Greek ears, this was not just an echo of pride. It was a revelation that history might stretch far beyond what their poets had sung. The Greeks, inheritors of Homer and Hesiod, already understood the sea as a realm of mystery. It was where gods tested men, where heroes vanished, and where knowledge disappeared into mist. Myths of sunken cities and divine punishments were not new. They shimmered through many cultures: Mesopotamian floods, Near Eastern deluges, and Egyptian cycles of destruction and renewal. The story of Atlantis seemed to gather them all into one perfect form. Yet, to Plato's contemporaries, this blend of Greek and Egyptian imagery also reflected something more subtle: the cross-pollination of ideas in a world growing smaller through contact and exchange. Athens was not isolated. Its philosophers conversed with travelers, sailors, and emissaries from Egypt, Phoenicia, and beyond. To the reflective listener, this blending of voices reveals how early civilizations shared a deep, almost instinctive belief in cycles: creation, flourishing, and fall. The Greeks called it hubris, the Egyptians, ma'at, disturbed, the Mesopotamians, divine judgment. Different names for the same pattern, the same rhythm of rise and ruin. Through this gentle lens, Atlantis becomes less an isolated myth and more a bridge between worlds. It is the meeting point of Egyptian antiquity and Greek philosophy, a mythic dialogue across cultures, centuries, and ways of understanding order. We can imagine the conversations in the Stoa and the shaded courtyards of Athens. Young scholars would question whether such an ancient war, as described by Plato, could ever have been real. Did Plato truly believe the Egyptians' account of a vanished empire across the sea? Or was it, as some suspected, a story crafted to lend ancient authority to his moral allegory? For Plato, the truth of the tale was less important than its meaning. In his mind, myth and philosophy were not opposites. They were partners. Myth was the vessel that carried wisdom to those who could not see it plainly. The Greeks called such tales logos, reason expressed through story. Atlantis was, perhaps, the most elegant of all his logoi, a parable wrapped in memory, shaped by the wisdom of both Greece and Egypt. Over time, however, listeners began to wonder, could the Egyptians really have preserved records that old? Did Solon truly visit Sais and hear these words spoken in a temple? Some historians point out that Egypt's own flood myths, stories of divine floods and cleansing waters, may have inspired Plato's structure. Others suggest that the priestly claim of 9,000 years was never meant to be taken literally, but as a poetic gesture to immeasurable antiquity. And yet, for all the uncertainty, there lingers a quiet fascination. What if the Egyptians did recall some fragment of a vanished civilization? Archaeology has shown that before the Bronze Age, before even the pyramids, there were flourishing cultures along the Mediterranean coastlines that disappeared with time, their ruins now buried beneath sediment or sea. Though far from the grandeur of Atlantis, they stand as reminders that the sea truly has swallowed worlds before. Perhaps this is why Plato's account resonates even now. It lives at the border between knowledge and mystery, where human memory fades and imagination begins. The Egyptians spoke of cycles, the Greeks of order, the philosophers of moral balance. Together, they formed a single melody about the fragility of greatness. In later centuries, many thinkers would return to this union of Egyptian and Greek thought as the heart of ancient wisdom. They imagined Atlantis as a parent civilization, the source of knowledge that seeded both Egypt's pyramids and Greece's philosophy. While history offers no proof of such lineage, the symbolic harmony remains beautiful, a vision of humanity connected across oceans and time, bound by a shared remembrance of creation and loss. Even in Plato's own dialogues, this connection is more poetic than literal. His description of Egyptian priests teaching Greek sages is a reflection of respect, the younger culture learning from the older, acknowledging that wisdom, like the sun, rises first in the east. It is a gesture of humility in a story otherwise filled with pride. As the dialogue closes, we are left with an image both tranquil and haunting. Egypt, the land of eternal order, speaking to Greece, the land of restless reason, about a civilization that rose too high and was swallowed by the sea. It is as if time itself were speaking, one age whispering to another about the impermanence of all things. And thus, the legend of Atlantis, though born in Greek philosophy, carried with it the heartbeat of many civilizations. It was not a single story, but a convergence, a gathering of the world's earliest memories of light and loss. As the centuries turned, these echoes of antiquity would fade into silence. Yet the seed was planted. Future generations would inherit Plato's tale and wonder if perhaps, beneath the waves or beneath the layers of forgotten history, there was once a truth too vast to vanish entirely. And so, as the memory of Greece and Egypt intertwined, the story of Atlantis drifted onward, into new lands, new tongues, and new imaginations. As the philosopher's ink dried and the world grew quieter, the legend began its slow voyage across time. As Plato's words echoed through centuries, they began to take on a life of their own, drifting beyond philosophy into legend. When Plato's dialogues began to circulate among his students and followers, they carried with them not just his philosophy, but his imagination. The story of Atlantis lingered in the air of the academy long after his death, a haunting parable that many admired, yet few understood. Some saw wisdom in it, others mere ornament. But all who read it felt something quietly powerful in its rhythm, a truth that seemed to hover between the real and the remembered. In the years that followed, the philosophers of Greece turned their gaze toward this strange tale. Aristotle, Plato's most famous student, was among the first to comment. His words were brief, almost dismissive. He who invented it also destroyed it, he is said to have remarked. To him, Atlantis was not history, but metaphor, a fine example of his teacher's tendency to use story as a vessel for moral instruction. Aristotle, ever the empiricist, sought proof and evidence. Without them, he found little reason to believe in islands that vanished overnight. And yet, not all shared his restraint. Others, less bound by reason, more attuned to the poetic, found in Plato's tale something worthy of contemplation. Crantor, one of the earliest interpreters of Plato's works, reportedly traveled to Egypt and claimed to have seen inscriptions describing a great island civilization now lost beneath the waves. Whether his claim was truth or embellishment, no one can say. But even his faint echo added depth to the mystery. Perhaps, somewhere between fable and fact, Plato had drawn from a forgotten memory. In this way, Atlantis began to drift, away from Plato's hands and into the vast currents of imagination. Each thinker who touched the story left a different mark upon it. Some saw it as moral allegory, others as distant memory, and still others as divine vision. By the time of Strabo, the great geographer of the Augustan age, Atlantis was treated with curiosity rather than conviction. Strabo acknowledged Plato's genius, but doubted the story's literal truth, suggesting instead that such myths spoke to the nature of the soul and the fragility of civilizations. To the Romans who inherited Greek wisdom, Atlantis became less of a place and more of an idea, an echo of the world's impermanence. The calm philosophers of the Stoic school saw it as an emblem of fate, the eternal rhythm of rise and fall, of order returning to chaos. In their eyes, every empire was Atlantis in miniature, a brief spark before the tide returned. Centuries later, in the twilight of the classical world, Neoplatonists would breathe new life into the myth. They read Plato's words not as political allegory, but as spiritual metaphor, Atlantis as the soul's lost home, the realm of pure form before the fall into matter. To them, the island was not a continent beneath the sea, but a state of consciousness, humanity's forgotten origin in divine unity. Thus, as empires faded and cities crumbled, Atlantis endured, carried in whispers of philosophy, mysticism, and poetry. Even when its physical existence was doubted, its symbolic power deepened. It became a mirror for every age that read it. In this shifting reflection, we see the first calm truth of Atlantis, that its endurance depends not on belief, but on meaning. Whether real or imagined, it speaks to something universal, a quiet recognition that all human creations, however great, rest upon fragile ground. Ancient readers found comfort in this. Atlantis offered a lens through which to view their own history. The fall of Troy, the decline of Athens, the ruins of forgotten cities that dotted the Mediterranean. The sea itself seemed to hold memory, as if it had witnessed too many worlds rise and fade. To live near it was to feel the presence of the past, vast and unanswerable. By the late antique period, the boundaries between history and myth had softened. Greek thinkers writing in Alexandria or Byzantium often cited Atlantis alongside the tales of the flood, of Deucalion, and of the drowned lands of the West. The legend had joined a greater tapestry, not a singular myth, but part of humanity's collective meditation on loss. In the quiet halls of philosophy, debates over Atlantis were less about geography than about the nature of truth. Could something unreal still reveal reality? Could a story invented to teach virtue carry within it the memory of forgotten events? The calm beauty of Plato's work is that it invited both possibilities without demanding an answer. To modern ears, this balance may sound elusive, but to the ancients, it was harmony. For them, myth was never falsehood. It was a vessel through which timeless truths were expressed. The line between what was remembered and what was imagined was never harsh, only blurred like the horizon over calm water. The earliest interpreters of Plato's Atlantis, therefore, lived within that gentle uncertainty. They neither dismissed nor confirmed. They reflected. The story was too luminous to be erased, too ambiguous to be resolved. It existed in the same quiet space where philosophy meets wonder, where knowledge reaches its limit and imagination begins to dream. Perhaps this is why Atlantis endured when so many other tales faded. It spoke not to certainty, but to the yearning for it, to the part of the human spirit that listens for echoes in the deep and wonders if what was lost might one day return. For those who read Plato in the centuries after his death, Atlantis became a mirror of their own civilization. The scholars of Alexandria, the monks of Byzantium, and the poets of the Mediterranean world all saw in it something familiar, the memory of greatness shadowed by impermanence. Each generation, watching the ruins of the last, found its reflection there. And so the legend endured, not as a record, but as a rhythm, a quiet heartbeat that reminded humankind of its cycles: creation, glory, decline, remembrance. Atlantis was not a world beneath the sea, but a meditation on time itself. And as the centuries deepened, that meditation would call to new voices: scholars, mystics, explorers, each convinced that they had found the key to the mystery. But for now, in the long dusk of the ancient world, Atlantis remained as Plato had left it, poised between memory and myth, a thought suspended like sunlight beneath the surface of the sea. And so began the search, not through seas, but through time itself. The Middle Ages had long folded the world into parchment. Maps were not windows, but mirrors of faith, vast oceans adorned with angels and monsters, the known pressed tightly against the unknown. Yet as Europe stirred from medieval slumber, the old certainties began to shift. The Renaissance dawned not in thunder, but in light, a quiet reawakening of curiosity, the rediscovery of old texts, and the belief that reason might once again explore what had been left to mystery. In dimly lit studies across Florence, Venice, and Lisbon, scholars and sailors alike found themselves drawn to the same horizon. Dusty manuscripts of Plato's Timaeus and Critias resurfaced in libraries, copied by patient hands, their Greek letters now breathing through the Latin tongues of the New Age. What had once been philosophical dialogue now felt almost prophetic. Plato's island, lost beyond the pillars of Heracles, seemed to whisper across time, calling to a generation ready to sail beyond all known edges. To thinkers of the 15th century, the ocean was not merely water. It was time itself, a shimmering expanse where the past might still be found. And so, when navigators like Columbus, Vespucci, and Cabot set sail across the Atlantic, many at home wondered, were they explorers of new worlds or rediscoverers of an ancient one? Among these dreamers were men of letters, theologians, astronomers, and philosophers who saw in every voyage a reflection of Plato's vision. Marsilio Ficino, the Florentine scholar who translated Plato's works into Latin, infused them with new meaning. To him, Atlantis was not only a cautionary allegory but a glimpse into a divine order, the pattern of civilizations rising and falling in cosmic rhythm. Through Ficino's translations, Plato spoke once more, his words echoing through Renaissance halls scented with ink and candle smoke. It was an age of rediscovery in every sense. Ancient manuscripts found new life beside globes and astrolabes. The Greeks had written of the known world, but the world had grown larger than their maps. Each new coastline seemed to whisper of a time before memory, and each discovery hinted at something that perhaps had already been known and lost. The idea began to take hold. Perhaps the Americas, or some far western island, were the remains of Atlantis. The Spanish historian Francisco López de Gomara wrote of lands once swallowed by the sea. The Italian philosopher Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, fascinated by the unity of all knowledge, suggested that myths concealed truths buried under layers of symbolism. For many, Atlantis was no longer just moral allegory. It became a riddle of geography, an ancient echo in the age of maps. The allure was irresistible. To believe in Atlantis was to believe that discovery itself could bridge time, that by sailing forward, one might somehow sail back. Across candlelit studies, scholars pored over ocean charts and Plato's passages, their minds afloat on speculation and wonder. The compass, once a novelty, became an instrument of hope, a needle pointing not merely north, but toward the promise of rediscovered worlds. Even those who doubted Atlantis found themselves softened by its poetry. Sir Thomas More, writing Utopia in 1516, imagined an island world far across the sea, a society governed by order and reason, untouched by the corruption of Europe. Though he never named it Atlantis, its shadow was there, the dream of a perfect realm beyond the known, a mirror of what humanity might once have been. In this way, Atlantis became part of the Renaissance imagination, not as fact, but as inspiration. Artists painted golden islands beyond the sunset. Poets spoke of worlds drowned and reborn. Sailors, guided by stars, whispered prayers that the lands they sought were not entirely new. that perhaps their ships were tracing the outlines of a memory older than history itself. It is here that we find the second calm discovery of Atlantis, that every age rediscovers it in its own image. To the Greeks, it was philosophy. To the Romans, a parable. And to the Renaissance, it became possibility, the meeting of myth and exploration, where reason and wonder could finally coexist. In that age, curiosity was not restless but reverent. The scholars who unrolled Plato's parchments did so with care, believing that wisdom might still be found in ancient words. The sailors who crossed the seas did not yet carry the arrogance of empire. They carried wonder. Theirs was not the conquest of lands, but the rediscovery of horizons. From the stone academies of Florence to the shipyards of Seville, the same question lingered. What if the new lands across the ocean were not new at all, but rediscovered fragments of a forgotten world? The question needed no answer. Its beauty was in its asking. With every mile sailed, the boundary between myth and discovery grew thinner. And somewhere between the pages of Plato's dialogues and the spray of salt against wooden hulls, the dream of Atlantis breathed again, not beneath the waves, but in the minds of those who believed that knowledge and wonder could share the same sea. And so the Renaissance, that quiet dawn of rediscovery, passed its light into the hands of the explorers. The myth of Atlantis, ancient, uncertain, and enduring, would sail with them into the age of oceans. In the soft lamplight of Renaissance workshops, cartographers bent over vast sheets of parchment, their hands steady, their breath shallow. Each line they drew was an act of both science and faith, a translation of the unknown into the comfort of form. The world, once a small circle surrounded by mystery, had begun to unfold. Yet, even as coastlines sharpened and seas gained names, the edges of these maps remained places of wonder. It was there, on the borders of certainty, that Atlantis continued to exist. The earliest modern maps bore faint inscriptions over the wide Atlantic. Antillia, Isle of Seven Cities, St. Brendan's Isle. Each name was a whisper from myth, carried forward by sailors' tales and the lingering voice of Plato. For the mapmakers of the 15th and 16th centuries, these phantom islands were more than decoration. They were hope made visible. A promise that something still waited to be found beyond the horizon. The craft of cartography in this age was not only about measuring the earth, it was about imagining it. Scholars such as Martin Waldseemüller and Gerardus Mercator tried to reconcile new discoveries with inherited visions. In their maps, the Atlantic stretched vast and glimmering, filled with both truth and speculation. Some included chains of islands that no ship had ever reached, echoes of stories told by sailors who swore they had seen land rise briefly from the sea, only to vanish again beneath the mist. To a Renaissance mind, the ocean was not empty space but a living history, a surface beneath which ancient worlds might still sleep. Atlantis, though uncharted, became a constant presence in the language of geography. For every coastline drawn with precision, another was shaded with mystery. Among thinkers, too, the dream persisted. Francis Bacon, in his 1627 work New Atlantis, transformed Plato's myth into a vision of moral and scientific idealism. His House of Salomon, a brotherhood of scholars devoted to discovery and knowledge, embodied the very spirit of the age. In Bacon's telling, Atlantis was no longer a fallen empire but a beacon of what humanity could become, rational, curious, and compassionate. His imagined island stood as both origin and destination, a mirror reflecting the Renaissance's faith in human reason. There was something profoundly gentle in this transformation. What began as a tale of divine punishment for pride had become a meditation on human progress. The Renaissance, in rediscovering the classical world, did not merely repeat its myths, it reinterpreted them, finding within them the seeds of renewal. Atlantis evolved from a tragedy into a dream of balance, a place where knowledge and virtue might coexist in harmony. In these centuries, imagination and empiricism were not enemies but companions. The astrologer and the astronomer shared the same sky. The alchemist and the natural philosopher worked beside one another, both seeking the hidden order of things. And the mapmaker, with his compass, quill, and colored inks, stood at the meeting point of myth and mathematics. Each new chart was both revelation and reminder that knowledge, like the ocean, had no end. Collectors and princes commissioned grand maps to adorn their halls, not only to display power, but to contemplate wonder. In these maps, the known world shimmered with gilded borders, while the unknown stretched beyond, dotted with painted monsters, radiant suns, and floating islands. It was here that art and science met, where the dream of Atlantis could live quietly, unchallenged, between fact and faith. The beauty of these maps lay not in their accuracy, but in their invitation. They asked those who gazed upon them to imagine, to trace a finger along the edge of the world and wonder what lay just beyond. They carried the same message Plato had once written in dialogue form, that the pursuit of truth is not a straight line, but a voyage, one that begins in curiosity and ends in reflection. It is perhaps no coincidence that as cartography advanced, so too did philosophy. The human mind, once confined by doctrine, began to stretch outward, like sails filling with wind. Each new continent discovered reshaped not only geography, but the idea of what humanity could know. Yet even as the maps grew clearer, the myth of Atlantis never faded, because it spoke not of place, but of possibility. This is the calm discovery at the heart of the mapmaker's dream, that the human spirit cannot chart everything it longs to understand. For even as they mapped mountains, rivers, and stars, there remained an inner sea, one that no compass could measure. Atlantis floated there, a symbol not of loss, but of longing. Francis Bacon understood this well. His new Atlantis was not a fable about what had been destroyed, but a guide to what might still be built. In the serene cadence of his prose, the myth found redemption. It became an emblem of the Renaissance faith, that through patience, reason, and humility, humankind could rediscover harmony with nature and with itself. As the 17th century dawned, the world no longer ended at the edge of parchment. Ships returned from the Americas with new maps, new plants, new stories. The oceans grew smaller, but the imagination remained vast. And in that endless expanse, half science, half soul, Atlantis drifted on, a silent island not yet found, but never forgotten. As map lines spread across the globe, the myth of Atlantis found new homes in the hearts of explorers. The age of discovery was also the age of remembrance, a time when humanity, seeking new worlds, quietly searched for the wisdom of the old. When Columbus's ships first touched the shores of the Americas, the world seemed to breathe again, as though an ancient circle had been completed. For centuries, the Atlantic had been the boundary between myth and memory, and now it yielded land. To those who looked upon this discovery with wonder, it was not only geography that had changed, but history itself. Many asked, quietly and with awe, had humanity, after so many centuries, found Atlantis? The late 15th and early 16th centuries were filled with such questions. In Spain and Portugal, where voyages set forth toward golden horizons, scholars and theologians searched for meaning equal to the scale of discovery. If new continents could rise from the sea, perhaps Plato's island, the one said to lie beyond the pillars of Heracles, had never truly vanished. It was a comforting thought, and a profound one. For the Renaissance mind, shaped by both faith and reason, discovery always sought design. The world, they believed, was a tapestry woven by divine intention, and no thread could exist without purpose. To find new lands was to seek their place in the old stories, to connect the unknown with the known. Among those who pondered these connections was Bartolomé de las Casas, the Dominican friar who became one of the earliest advocates for the rights of indigenous peoples. Deeply moved by the complexity and advancement of native civilizations in the New World, he speculated that they might be descended from the Atlanteans of Plato's tale, not as survivors of mythic catastrophe, but as heirs of forgotten wisdom. For Las Casas and others of his generation, such thoughts were not idle fantasy. They were part of a search for moral and historical order. The grandeur of the Aztec temples, the intricate calendars of the Maya, and the harmony of Incan engineering all seemed to echo the description of a once great civilization destroyed by its own excess. If Plato's Atlantis was a parable of pride and punishment, then perhaps these new societies were proof that wisdom, too, could survive the flood of time. The idea resonated across Europe. Scholars like Francisco Lopez de Gamara and José de Acosta speculated that ancient migrations might have connected both hemispheres, that across some long-lost bridge or chain of islands, knowledge and bloodlines had once flowed freely between worlds. Their writings blended theology, natural philosophy, and myth into a single, quiet question. Could all humanity share a single origin, scattered and reshaped by the seas? It was an idea both humble and grand. Humble in its search for unity, grand in its scope of time. For in these reflections, Atlantis became more than an island. It became a symbol of connection. The Americas were no longer isolated new lands but part of a continuous human story, stretching back to an age when the Earth itself seemed smaller, closer, and whole. But even as the theory found admirers, it remained a dream. The evidence was elusive, and as science matured, it began to separate wonder from proof. Yet for a moment in history, a moment between faith and empiricism, it was possible to imagine that the waves of the Atlantic had not erased the past, but merely hidden it. What captivated the thinkers of this era was not the promise of treasure or empire, but the mystery of kinship. The same wind that filled the sails of conquistadors also carried whispers of memory, of an older world, submerged yet still speaking through symbols, architecture, and myth. Even the names they gave to places reflected this yearning. Antilia, Atlantica, Hesperides. The maps grew clearer, but the imagination continued to shimmer just beyond their edges. This moment, fragile, luminous, and brief, marked the height of Atlantis as historical possibility. For as the voyages continued and colonial ambitions darkened the age, the myth softened. It retreated once again into reflection, leaving behind only a question. Not, where was Atlantis, but why do we still long for it? The calm discovery here is quiet yet profound. Atlantis had always been less about geography and more about humanity's longing for continuity, the hope that the unknown might somehow complete the known. In a world newly expanded, people still yearned for origin, for an explanation that joined all shores in one story. As centuries turned, that longing would evolve. The search for Atlantis would no longer sail with caravels or galleons, but with the human imagination itself, drifting through philosophy, science, and spirit. As the sails of exploration faded over the horizon, the search for Atlantis turned inward, toward the mind itself. The 18th century arrived like the steady light of morning after a long, dream-filled night. The fires of exploration had cooled, the maps of the world were drawn more clearly, and in their quiet wake came reflection. The Renaissance had dreamed of Atlantis as a lost harmony between man and nature, but now the Enlightenment sought to weigh that dream upon the scales of reason. In coffee houses and academies across Europe, philosophers and naturalists turned their eyes not to the heavens of myth, but to the earth beneath their feet. They questioned not only the legends of the ancients, but the very nature of belief itself. Could a tale told by Plato in the dim halls of Athens survive the scrutiny of logic? Was Atlantis history or metaphor? Among those who pondered these questions was Athanasius Kircher, a Jesuit polymath whose curiosity knew no borders. In the previous century, he had drawn elaborate maps of Atlantis, imagining it as a vast continent stretching across the Atlantic, its peaks now forming the islands of the Azores and Canaries. Yet Kircher's vision, though detailed, was not one of superstition. He saw the Earth as a living organism, shaped by fire, water, and time. His Atlantis was not merely legend, but a geological hypothesis, that the seas themselves had swallowed land through natural upheaval. It was an idea both ancient and modern, and it resonated in an age beginning to see the planet as dynamic and alive. But as Kircher's maps circulated, a new spirit of inquiry rose that would soon challenge such imaginations. By the time of Voltaire, the mood of Europe had changed. Faith in revelation gave way to faith in observation. Myths were no longer sacred echoes of divine truth, but mirrors of human psychology, reflections of what people once needed to believe. Voltaire, ever the skeptic, dismissed Atlantis with a smile. Plato invented it, he wrote, and the world has believed in it ever since. To him, the myth was a reminder of how easily wonder could outpace wisdom. Yet even Voltaire's irony could not erase the fascination. Enlightenment thinkers might have stripped the world of its angels and omens, but they could not strip it of mystery. The same curiosity that drove them to dissect light, gravity, and motion also compelled them to look backward, to wonder how myths had shaped the long human conversation with truth. The new science of geology, too, began to offer clues that gave old stories fresh meaning. The Earth, scholars discovered, bore marks of immense age and violence. Fossils embedded in stone spoke of vanished worlds and ancient seas. In these findings, some glimpsed a poetic echo of Atlantis, not as a single lost island, but as a symbol of the countless civilizations and landscapes the planet had already forgotten. The tone of inquiry had shifted from faith in myth to faith in process. To Enlightenment minds, it was not necessary to believe in Atlantis literally to be moved by what it represented. The story became an allegory for impermanence, a reminder that even greatness, when isolated from virtue, must eventually fall. Plato's moral lesson, once adorned by mysticism, now found new dignity in philosophy. And yet, beneath the calm of reason, a subtler longing remained. For all their skepticism, many Enlightenment thinkers felt the quiet ache of what had been lost, not Atlantis itself, but the sense of wonder it inspired. The universe, vast and mechanical, was now explained in terms of law and order, yet somewhere in that precision, the poetry of mystery dimmed. Still, the Enlightenment gave the legend a kind of rebirth. Stripped of its literalism, Atlantis survived as metaphor, the archetype of vanished wisdom, the moral echo of hubris undone. In literature, it became a device for reflection. In science, a hypothesis for ancient cataclysms. In art, a symbol of fragile beauty. Even as reason tightened its grip on thought, imagination lingered, not defeated, but transformed. The calm discovery of this era lies in its paradox, that skepticism does not extinguish myth, but refines it. The Enlightenment did not bury Atlantis, it placed it under glass, inviting examination instead of devotion. The story no longer floated beyond the horizon, it rested now in the mind, a specimen of humanity's need to dream, even while awake. By the late 18th century, the myth had entered the quiet company of ideas that could neither be proven nor forgotten. It stood between the worlds of science and art, a bridge of curiosity stretching across centuries. And though reason ruled, it could not silence that ancient whisper beneath the waves, that soft reminder that not all truth can be measured, and not all wonder must be explained. But reason alone could not still the human yearning to find what was lost. By the late 18th century, the human gaze had turned downward, away from the heavens of myth and toward the ground beneath their feet. The earth, once seen as a stable foundation, began to reveal itself as a restless being, layered, folded, and ancient beyond measure. The new science of geology was not born in a single discovery, but in a slow awakening, a realization that the planet itself was a storyteller, its straight pages of time written in stone. For centuries, people had looked to the sky for revelation. Now, they found it beneath the soil. Quarries and cliffs became cathedrals of a different faith, one built not on scripture, but on observation. Each fossil unearthed, each ripple of sediment exposed, spoke of a world both familiar and vanished. And in those silent forms, preserved through unimaginable ages, many found themselves remembering the old story of Atlantis, the dream of a world lost to the sea. The early geologists were poets of patience. James Hutton, often called the father of modern geology, observed that the earth was not fixed but alive in motion, a cycle of uplift and erosion, of creation and return. No vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end, he wrote in 1788. His words carried a quiet grandeur, a calm awe before the vastness of time. To Hutton and those who followed, the earth's surface was not a ruin but a rhythm, a living, breathing system of renewal. And yet, as these discoveries unfolded, the imagination stirred once more. If continents could rise and fall, if mountains were the remnants of ancient seas, could it not be possible that a great island, even a continent, had once slipped beneath the ocean's surface? The myth of Atlantis found itself, for a brief moment, standing again in the light of possibility. In France, Georges Cuvier studied fossil beds and concluded that the Earth had suffered many catastrophes, floods, quakes, and fires that had reshaped the continents again and again. His theory of catastrophism suggested that the planet's past was marked by repeated destruction and renewal. Though Cuvier himself never invoked Atlantis, others could not help but hear its echo in his work. What Plato had described as divine punishment, Cuvier saw as natural law. Both told of worlds drowned and reborn. The rhythm of geology mirrored the rhythm of myth. Each stratum of rock became a line in a cosmic history, a record of worlds lost not to morality, but to time. The sea, once imagined as a realm of divine mystery, became the agent of transformation. It shaped the coasts, carved the cliffs, and carried the memory of vanished lands within its depths. The ocean no longer needed to hide Atlantis to be wondrous. It was wondrous because it revealed how fragile and impermanent all things are. There was serenity in this new understanding. The Enlightenment had taught humanity to seek cause and effect, but geology reintroduced humility, a recognition that the Earth's story exceeded the span of human life. In those slow, silent processes, people found not contradiction, but comfort. The Earth endured. It changed, yes, but always continued. To the thoughtful observer, the old myths now seemed less false than simply transformed. Perhaps Plato's story was never meant to describe a single island, but the endless truth of change, that civilizations, like continents, rise and fall, shaped by forces beyond their control. The birth of geology did not kill myth, it matured it. The Earth became both scripture and metaphor. Scientists traced the outlines of continents that once fit together like puzzle pieces: Europe and Africa, South America and Antarctica. Long before the idea of plate tectonics, these patterns whispered a tantalizing thought, that once the world had been whole. As the 19th century dawned, explorers and naturalists carried this curiosity to distant lands. In the mountains of the Andes, seashells were found thousands of feet above sea level. In Siberia, entire mammoths lay frozen beneath the permafrost. The evidence was undeniable. The Earth had changed in ways beyond imagination. To those who listened closely, these discoveries did not silence the legend of Atlantis, but reframe it. The myth was no longer about punishment or paradise. It was about impermanence. This is the calm discovery that geology offered the world, that the planet, in its quiet movement, had known countless Atlantises, lands drowned, mountains uplifted, species forgotten. Every stone was a fragment of an older world. Every fossil, a whisper of time. And so the scientists, with their hammers and notebooks, became the new chroniclers of creation. They no longer sought a single island beneath the waves, but the deeper truth that all of Earth's history was written in cycles of loss and renewal. In that realization, Atlantis ceased to be a place and became an idea, a mirror held to the human condition. For as the Earth changed, so too did humanity. We built, we dreamed, we fell, and we began again. And in that endless rhythm, the myth of Atlantis found its quietest and most enduring form, not in the depths of the sea, but in the layered memory of the world itself. With every fossil on Earth, the line between memory and myth blurred just a little more. By the dawn of the 19th century, humanity's gaze, once fixed upon the stars, began to turn toward the vast, uncharted deep. The ocean, that timeless mirror of sky and thought, was no longer merely a boundary between lands. It became a frontier. Explorers, cartographers, and scientists alike sought to measure its hidden contours, to trace with lines and instruments what the eye could never see. In those years, the great naval powers were driven by a mixture of curiosity and necessity. Accurate charts meant safe passage for ships and expanding empires. But beneath that practical motive stirred something older, a desire to uncover what the world still kept secret. The myths of Atlantis, though softened by centuries of skepticism, still lingered at the edges of imagination. When the first deep-sea soundings were taken, some whispered that we might at last find proof of what Plato once described, a land swallowed by the sea, waiting to be found. The early measurements were simple, almost primitive by modern standards. Sailors would lower a weighted line, a lead line, often marked with cloth or leather, into the water, counting the fathoms as it sank. It was slow work, and the ocean rarely gave up its secrets easily. Yet, as ships crossed the Atlantic, a pattern began to emerge. Between Europe and the Americas lay an unseen ridge, stretching like a vast underwater spine across the ocean floor. It would come to be known as the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, though in the 19th century, its full shape was still a mystery. Early reports of shallower depths in certain regions, particularly between the Azores and the Caribbean, sparked renewed speculation. Could this be the submerged backbone of a lost continent? The thought took quiet hold in both scientific circles and popular imagination. Maps were drawn. Theories flourished. Some scholars, like Ignatius Donnelly, who would later write Atlantis, the Antediluvian World in 1882, blended geology with myth, arguing that Atlantis had once bridged the old world and the new. His work, though filled with conjecture, resonated deeply with readers hungry for connection, a bridge not only of land, but of meaning. Even among serious scientists, curiosity persisted. The Challenger expedition of 1872 to 1876, the first great voyage of oceanographic research, revealed an ocean far more complex than anyone had imagined. Its crew discovered the true depth of the sea, 5, 6, even 8 miles deep in some trenches. They dredged the seabed, collected samples, and recorded life forms that glowed in perpetual darkness. The deep ocean, once thought barren, was alive, dynamic, ancient, and full of quiet mysteries. For those who listened with wonder, the discovery of these underwater landscapes seemed almost poetic. Mountains rose unseen beneath the waves. Valleys yawned in silence, untouched by sunlight since the world began. To imagine Atlantis in this new world of geological revelation was less a leap of faith than an act of awe. Yet as instruments improved, so too did skepticism. By the early 20th century, sonar technology, born from the needs of war, began to map the ocean floor with precision never before possible. Pulses of sound traveled downward, bouncing back to reveal shape and distance. What once took months of perilous sounding could now be captured in moments. The sea, long an enigma, began to unfold in contour lines and grayscale reliefs. And still, the legend endured. Each new discovery seemed to invite the old question, was Atlantis real? Even when evidence pointed elsewhere, when maps revealed no sunken cities, no ancient walls, the dream persisted. Because what humanity sought was never just a place. It was understanding. It was reflection. As scientists traced the Mid-Atlantic Ridge with sonar, they found something perhaps more profound than any lost continent. They discovered a rift, a place where the Earth itself was being born. New crust rose from molten rock deep within the mantle, spreading outward as the continents slowly drifted apart. In the story of that ridge lay the truth of a living planet, and perhaps the truest echo of Atlantis, a world forever creating and consuming itself. The myth, then, was not disproven but transformed. Atlantis became less a lost island and more a symbol of change, of loss, of the eternal motion of nature and mind. For each generation, it reflected a new kind of longing, the Enlightenments for reason, the Romantics for wonder, the modern ages for discovery and data. And so the ocean remained what it had always been, vast, indifferent, yet deeply human in its mystery. For even when science drew its maps and measured its depths, imagination continued to drift just beyond the last echo of sonar. The sea, like the mind, still held places unseen. As science mapped the ocean, imagination filled the spaces it could not yet see. As the Renaissance drew its final breath and the Enlightenment dawned, a different kind of exploration began, one not of oceans or continents, but of the hidden landscapes of the soul. In candlelit chambers and quiet libraries, men and women turned ancient manuscripts, seeking a wisdom that might reconcile heaven and earth. To them, the story of Atlantis was not a legend of lost land but a whisper of forgotten truth, a symbol of human potential, divine order, and the fall that comes when knowledge outpaces virtue. The philosophers of this era were inheritors of a long tradition. From the Hermetic texts of Alexandria to the geometric visions of Pythagoras, they believed that beneath the shifting surface of myth lay immutable laws, the mathematics of the cosmos, the harmonies of creation. Atlantis, in their view, was not merely a sunken island but a reflection of those laws manifest in human form, a civilization that once lived in perfect balance with the universe, until imbalance, spiritual and moral, pulled it beneath the waves. In the writings of the Renaissance Magi, Marsilio Ficino, Giordano Bruno, and others, Atlantis took on a sacred tone. They read Plato not as a historian but as a mystagogue, a bearer of secret knowledge veiled in allegory. When Plato spoke of an age when gods and men communed, when the world was ordered by justice and beauty, these thinkers saw not a parable but a memory, the echo of an earlier world, perhaps before the flood, when humanity had not yet fallen from its divine nature. In the Hermetic tradition, all knowledge was connected, astrology to alchemy, number to soul, man to cosmos. Atlantis fit perfectly within this web. Its story symbolized the loss of unity, the sundering of spirit and matter. The sinking of the island was not just geological, but metaphysical, a descent from golden harmony into the dissonance of history. To the Rosicrucians and later the Freemasons, Atlantis represented an ideal brotherhood, a community of enlightened beings who lived by sacred geometry, divine proportion, and moral virtue. Their temples, with their compass and square, sought to rebuild what Atlantis had once embodied, a structure of wisdom that mirrored the order of the heavens. In quiet ceremonies beneath vaulted ceilings, initiates meditated on the ruins of that lost perfection, not in the sea, but in the human condition itself. These were centuries of rediscovery. Ancient texts long hidden in monastic vaults were translated and studied anew. Scholars traced connections between Egyptian hieroglyphs, Greek myths, and biblical floods. Some claimed that Egypt, cradle of mysteries, had itself inherited its wisdom from the survivors of Atlantis, priests who fled the deluge and built new temples along the Nile. The pyramids, in this view, were not beginnings but memorials, stone echoes of an older world that had already perished once. In this quiet vision, Atlantis became the archetype of the primordial civilization, the first dawn of human consciousness, when knowledge and spirituality were still one. It was not so much a myth as a metaphysical map, pointing backward through time to an origin beyond history. Whether such a place ever physically existed mattered less than what it represented, the enduring human intuition that we have lost something, some deeper harmony, some forgotten grace. There is a stillness to this belief, a meditative quality that transcends the literal. When these thinkers spoke of Atlantis, they were also speaking of themselves, of humanity's inner fall, its yearning to remember. The lost city beneath the waves mirrored the depths of the human mind, vast, mysterious, and filled with fragments of a forgotten truth. In that sense, the legend became a prayer. Every act of study, every page turned beneath the flicker of lamplight, was a quiet form of devotion, an attempt to retrieve not just lost knowledge, but lost wisdom. Atlantis, the philosophers said, could be found not in the sea, but in the soul. And so, across Europe, in the gentle murmur of libraries and the sacred geometry of secret societies, the idea of Atlantis endured, transformed into symbol, preserved in allegory, and reborn as philosophy. Its story drifted far from Plato's dialogues, yet its essence remained the same. The dream of balance, the memory of light, the yearning for the world before the fall. As mystics dreamt of Atlantis as a paradise lost, others began to search for it once more, this time upon the maps of a changing world. As Europe turned the page into the 18th and 19th centuries, the myth of Atlantis did not fade beneath the rational light of science. It transformed. No longer confined to Plato's pages or the speculations of classical philosophers, it became something more intimate, a mirror of the spirit, a parable of human evolution and a symbol of the soul's forgotten home. In an age suspended between Enlightenment reason and romantic yearning, Atlantis returned quietly, not through maps or telescopes, but through the whispered philosophies of secret orders and the inner journeys of mystics. The Rosicrucians were among the first to breathe new life into this ancient vision. To them, Atlantis symbolized a lost age of enlightenment, a golden dawn when humanity lived in harmony with divine law. They spoke not of marble cities sinking into the sea, but of a spiritual fall, a time when humankind, once radiant with divine understanding, descended into ignorance and separation. The sea that swallowed Atlantis was not made of water, but of forgetfulness, the vast unconscious that buried our higher nature beneath the tides of time. Within their writings, Atlantis became both history and prophecy. The Rosicrucian ideal was to rekindle that lost light, to build, through study and virtue, a new Atlantis within the mind. Their symbols reflected this hope, the rose unfolding within the cross, spirit blooming within matter. To them, rediscovering Atlantis meant remembering what humanity truly was before it fell asleep in the dream of material existence. By the 19th century, this vision found new expression in the growing theosophical movement, a spiritual philosophy that sought to unite science, religion, and ancient wisdom into one harmonious truth. Founded by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, theosophy offered a cosmic framework in which Atlantis played a central role. In her great work, The Secret Doctrine, 1888, Blavatsky described a series of root races, successive stages of human evolution, both physical and spiritual. The fourth of these, she said, was the Atlantean race, mighty, wise, and powerful, yet undone by pride and misuse of knowledge. Though framed in mystical language, the story carried deep symbolic resonance. The Atlanteans, according to Blavatsky, were not monsters or gods, but archetypes of ourselves, a mirror of the human condition. Their downfall, she wrote, came not from divine punishment, but from imbalance. Intellect without compassion, power without humility. Through their loss, humanity learned a quiet truth, that wisdom must be tempered by love and knowledge by spirit. In this sense, theosophy did not seek to prove Atlantis as a place, but to use it as a teaching, a reminder that progress, without moral awakening, leads only to ruin. Beneath its esoteric layers, this was a story of the human journey itself, the long arc from innocence through forgetting, toward rediscovery and illumination. In the parlors and study rooms of Victorian England and America, these ideas found eager audiences. The world was changing quickly. Railways, telegraphs, and microscopes were rewriting reality. Yet, amid the machinery of modernity, many felt an ache for the sacred, a longing for something timeless. Atlantis, in its new esoteric form, became a kind of refuge, a mythic garden within the mechanized world, where the spiritual imagination could still wander freely. Artists and poets began to borrow from these mystical visions. Painters depicted cities of light beneath tranquil waters. Writers spoke of crystal temples and radiant beings who once walked the earth before the sea reclaimed them. To the rationalist, such imagery was fantasy. To the mystic, it was metaphor, the language of the soul. The Atlantean soul, as it came to be called in some circles, was the idea that within each person lay a fragment of this lost wisdom, a spark of the ancient harmony that once governed both man and nature. Meditation, study, and moral purification were seen as ways to awaken it, to recover the inner Atlantis hidden within the subconscious depths. This merging of myth and mysticism gave the legend new endurance. Unlike the explorers who searched the sea for ruins of stone, these seekers turned inward, believing that the true continent lay beneath the surface of awareness. Their Atlantis was crystalline, not geological but spiritual, composed of thought, vibration, and light. It was the bridge between the material and the divine. And yet, this esoteric revival was not without quiet tension. While scientists of the time sought evidence in fossils and rocks, the mystics sought it in symbols and dreams. One measured the world with instruments, the other with intuition. Between them lay the enduring beauty of Atlantis, a myth that could not be confined to one truth, because it spoke to something that lived in both realms. The enduring allure of the Atlantean ideal was, perhaps, that it combined nostalgia with aspiration. It told of what had been lost, yet also of what could be regained. It suggested that human destiny was cyclical, that the fall of Atlantis was not an ending, but a lesson, one that each age must relearn in its own way. And so, through lodges and salons, through meditations and manuscripts, the story flowed quietly on. Not a tale of ruins or relics, but of remembrance. The sea that once swallowed Atlantis was no longer an obstacle to discovery, but a metaphor, the still, inner ocean that waits within us all. In the hush between science and faith, Atlantis became a dream of who we once were, and who we might be again. Yet, beyond temples of thought and mystic texts, another Atlantis awaited, one built upon the evidence of Earth itself. Across the world's oldest stories, there echoes a single note, a memory of a time before, a fall, a flood, a beginning again. In the calm rhythm of ancient myths and sacred texts, one can hear the same pulse that beats beneath Plato's Atlantis. The rise of a great civilization, its corruption, and its submersion into oblivion. Whether in the desert sands of Mesopotamia, the valleys of India, or the mountains of the Andes, humanity seems to remember a world that was lost, and the longing to return to it. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's earliest surviving tales, speaks of a flood sent by the gods to cleanse the earth, sparing only the wise Utnapishtim, a survivor who carries memory through water. Centuries later, the Book of Genesis would echo the same theme, a deluge washing away human pride, with Noah's Ark floating as both vessel and promise. The pattern repeats across cultures. In the Hindu Puranas, where Manu is saved by a divine fish from the rising sea. In Greek myth, where Deucalion and Pyrrha repopulate the world after the waters subside. And in Mesoamerican lore, where the world ends and begins anew through cycles of water and fire. Each of these stories holds within it a calm, enduring truth, that destruction and renewal are part of the same rhythm, the breathing of time itself. And Atlantis, though born in Plato's mind, seems to rest within that same universal memory. It is the Hellenic reflection of a pattern humanity never forgot, the knowledge that all things rise and all things pass, only to rise again in some new form. To the faithful, these tales were reminders of divine justice and mercy, warnings against arrogance, yet assurances that grace endures even through catastrophe. To philosophers, they were allegories of the human spirit, our ascent toward wisdom, our inevitable fall, and our quiet rediscovery of meaning amid ruin. To mystics, they spoke of cycles, ages of light and shadow, of civilizations blooming and fading in the eternal tide of creation. In this way, Atlantis became not an anomaly, but a chapter within the great book of myth. Its fall was not unique, but archetypal. The gods of Plato, punishing excess and imbalance, were kin to the gods of flood and fire, who restore harmony through renewal. Beneath different names and tongues, all spoke of the same order, that the world, like the soul, must sometimes be cleansed to begin again. Even in the age of Enlightenment science, this pattern lingered. Early geologists, reading the layers of the earth, found not myth but sediment, strata that told of ancient seas and vanished lands. Catastrophism, the theory that great floods and upheavals shaped the planet, carried an echo of those older beliefs. Though the language had changed, the sentiment remained. The world is fragile, and its history, like ours, is punctuated by both creation and loss. This blending of science and myth produced a quiet beauty. Theologians found in geology the hand of God, scientists, in myth, a memory of natural truth. The two disciplines, often seen as opposites, briefly touched at the edges, united by a shared wonder before the mystery of time. Atlantis sat at that very crossroads, half faith, half evidence, suspended between memory and measurement. Artists and poets of the 19th century embraced this duality. They painted visions of deluge and dawn, of cities drowned beneath tranquil seas. The waters, to them, were not only instruments of destruction but mirrors, reflecting human frailty and divine forgiveness alike. In the image of Atlantis descending beneath the waves, they saw the paradox of all faith, that loss is often the beginning of understanding. And perhaps that is why the story endures. Atlantis is not simply the Greek myth it appears to be. It is the reflection of every paradise lost, every spiritual fall, every human attempt to understand why creation contains both beauty and impermanence. The name changes, Eden, Dilmun, Lemuria, Mu, but the longing remains the same. It may be that all these stories, scattered across continents and centuries, are fragments of a single ancient memory, not of an actual flood or continent, but of the moment humanity first became aware of its own fragility, the dawning consciousness that we, too, are part of nature's cycles. So, when we speak of Atlantis, we are also speaking of the flood, of Eden, of beginnings and ends. We are remembering the same truth told 1,000 ways, that everything we build, no matter how radiant, belongs to time. Perhaps every faith remembers a paradise lost, and Atlantis is but one name for it. As faiths told their stories and mystics dreamed their dreams, a new century prepared to search for Atlantis not in spirit, but in stone. The year was 1882. Steamships crossed the oceans, telegraphs stitched continents together, and humankind stood on the threshold of a new century. It was an age of wonder and of confidence, an era when science promised to reveal every secret and exploration reached even the poles. Yet beneath this triumph of reason lay a quieter hunger, the desire to belong to something older, something that could bind the modern world to its ancient beginnings. Into this atmosphere stepped a man named Ignatius Donnelly, a former U.S. congressman turned visionary writer, whose book Atlantis, the antediluvian world, would reawaken a sleeping legend. Donnelly was not a scholar in the strict sense, but a man of immense curiosity and conviction. Living in Minnesota, far from the old centers of learning, he devoted years to studying classical texts, geological theories, and linguistic comparisons. His ambition was vast, nothing less than to prove that every major civilization on Earth had descended from one lost motherland, Atlantis. He wrote not with the detachment of an academic, but with the fervor of a poet discovering revelation. To him, Atlantis was not a fable. It was history's missing foundation. In the antediluvian world, Donnelly argued that the flood myths of every culture, from the Bible's deluge to the Aztec and Babylonian epics, all pointed to the same cataclysm, the sinking of Atlantis beneath the sea. He described the island as the true cradle of human civilization, the birthplace of agriculture, metallurgy, writing, and religion. From this single source, he claimed, survivors spread across the globe after the disaster, carrying fragments of Atlantean knowledge to Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Americas. In his telling, the pyramids, Stonehenge, and the temples of the Maya were all children of one parent culture, scattered by the waves of catastrophe. For Donnelly's readers, it was intoxicating. The world he painted shimmered with coherence and meaning. In an age when Darwin's theory of evolution had unsettled old certainties, Atlantis offered something comforting, a grand story that reunited science, scripture, and imagination. It suggested that progress was not merely accidental but inherited, that humanity's genius was ancient, not new. Donnelly wrote in the language of evidence, though much of his proof was poetic rather than empirical. He cited geological patterns in the Atlantic Ocean, linguistic similarities between distant peoples, and myths that seemed to share uncanny parallels. Yet what captivated readers was not the data itself, but the feeling his narrative evoked, the serene conviction that the world, for all its divisions, shared one luminous origin. His tone was not sensational but earnest. Donnelly's Atlantis was not a fantasy of golden temples or mystical powers. It was a civilization of builders, thinkers, and seekers, human in every way, yet touched by a harmony modern society had lost. He imagined them as wise stewards of nature, masters of art and reason, undone not by gods but by the forces of their own ambition. Their fall, he wrote, was both literal and moral, a reminder that knowledge without humility brings ruin. In this, Donnelly echoed Plato's warning, giving the myth fresh ethical weight for a world transformed by industry and empire. The late 19th century was fertile ground for such ideas. Archaeology was uncovering Troy, unearthing the temples of Egypt, and bringing ancient myths to life again. Every discovery blurred the line between legend and history. If Troy, once dismissed as poetic fiction, could be found beneath the soil of Anatolia, might not Atlantis also wait beneath the waves? The thought resonated deeply with a public eager for wonder within the frame of reason. Donnelly's influence rippled outward in quiet but lasting waves. His work inspired generations of writers, spiritualists, and early archaeologists. The notion of a single prehistoric civilization seeding all others would reappear in countless forms, in theosophy, in early anthropology, and later in 20th-century fiction and pseudoscience. Even modern theories of cultural diffusion, though grounded in real evidence, carried a faint echo of his vision. Yet, as time passed, science moved on. The discovery of plate tectonics, the understanding of continental drift, and advances in dating methods left no place for a vanished mid-Atlantic continent. Donnelly's literal Atlantis faded from serious study, but the myth he rekindled did not die, because it had never truly been about geography. It was about meaning. Donnelly had given Atlantis something new, modern form. He transformed it from a philosopher's allegory into a global origin myth for an industrial age. In doing so, he bridged two worlds, the rational and the romantic, the measurable and the mythical. His Atlantis became the meeting place of faith and inquiry, a story both ancient and urgently modern. And though scholars would later dismiss his theories, the beauty of Donnelly's vision endures in the collective imagination. It is there in every story of lost worlds, in every whisper of forgotten wisdom beneath the sea. His words remind us that even false maps can guide true journeys, that imagination, when guided by wonder, can uncover truths the mind alone cannot grasp. Can a single book revive a world that never was? Donnelly proved that it could, and that sometimes belief itself is enough to make the invisible endure. As Donnelly's vision spread across the world, Atlantis became more than myth again, it became modern. The 19th century was a paradox, an age of microscopes and miracles, telescopes and table-rapping seances. It was the century when reason rose like a dawn, yet the shadows of wonder refused to fade. Steam and steel carried humanity to the ends of the earth, but the soul of the age still drifted toward mystery, toward something that science alone could not name. In that delicate twilight between discovery and dream, Atlantis became a bridge, spanning what was known and what was still longed for. The Victorian world adored progress. Railways stitched nations together, telegraphs sent words faster than thought, and geology revealed a planet far older than anyone had dared imagine. Each layer of rock whispered epics of time. Fossils spoke of vanished species and forgotten worlds. To scientists, it was thrilling, a revelation that the Earth itself was alive with deep history. Yet for many, this same realization brought unease. If humankind was not created whole and recent, as faith once taught, then where had civilization truly begun? Into this uncertainty, the myth of Atlantis offered comfort. It suggested a grand beginning, not a random rise from chaos, but a lineage, a design. Even as science dismantled the myths of Genesis, Atlantis reassembled them into a new form, a lost golden age, a parent civilization, a memory of unity before the great scattering of nations. It was the perfect myth for a restless century. Victorian thinkers lived at the crossroads of empiricism and enchantment. They attended scientific lectures by day and spiritual seances by night. The same public that thrilled to Darwin's Origin of Species also devoured stories of mesmerism, reincarnation, and ancient wisdom. Newspapers printed discoveries of new fossils beside tales of ghostly apparitions. It was a world where fact and faith intertwined like ivy, each feeding the other's growth. Atlantis found a new home in that mixture. To the rationalist, it was a hypothesis to be tested, perhaps a sunken continent between Europe and America, hinted at by undersea ridges and geological anomalies. To the dreamer, it was a vision, an echo of a spiritual homeland where humanity had once lived in harmony. Both interpretations flourished side by side, feeding a culture hungry for both evidence and enchantment. In London drawing rooms and Parisian salons, the lost world of Atlantis was discussed as eagerly as electricity or evolution. Pseudoscientific societies began to appear, small gatherings of gentlemen scholars who blended geology, linguistics, and mythology into grand syntheses. Their journals speculated on the migration of ancient peoples, the meaning of megaliths, and the geological possibility of submerged continents. It was not mockery or deceit. It was curiosity unrestrained by the limits of proof. At the same time, spiritualism swept across Europe and America. Mediums spoke of souls recalling past lives in ancient lands. Theosophists, led by figures like Helena Blavatsky, spoke of Atlanteans as an earlier root race, a stage in the cosmic evolution of humankind. These teachings, blending Hindu philosophy, Western mysticism, and bits of science, enchanted a public seeking meaning in a rapidly mechanized world. To them, Atlantis was not just a place. It was a symbol of the lost divine within humanity itself. Science, for its part, was becoming increasingly cautious. The great institutions, the Royal Society, the Geological Survey, the British Museum, turned away from speculation and demanded evidence. They sought to separate discovery from myth, observation from imagination. Yet, as they mapped the oceans and uncovered ancient ruins, even the most skeptical minds could not fully escape the poetry of the unknown. Consider the birth of archaeology. Excavations in Mesopotamia revealed cities buried for millennia. Ur, Nineveh, Babylon, once thought legendary. In Egypt, hieroglyphs began to speak again, their voices rising from stone after 4,000 years of silence. These discoveries blurred the boundary between fable and fact. If the Bible's cities could be unearthed, why not Plato's island? For every new truth science revealed, imagination opened another door. Victorian writers sensed this tension and turned it into art. Jules Verne, in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, imagined Captain Nemo gliding over the ruins of Atlantis in his silent submarine. The poet Alfred Tennyson spoke of the world's gray fathers and kingdoms drowned in time. Painters filled their canvases with ruins beneath green waves, while composers wrote symphonies inspired by forgotten empires. The myth had evolved, no longer merely a story of loss, but a meditation on the fragility of progress itself. In this way, Atlantis mirrored the Victorian soul. The more the world advanced, the more it yearned for origins. The greater its mastery over nature, the more it feared losing touch with meaning. Even scientists, in their quiet moments, wondered whether myth held some symbolic truth that measurement alone could not reach. And so, science and pseudoscience, reason and romance, existed not as enemies but as reflections of one another. Each, in its own way, was a search for connection. Both sought to understand humanity's place in the vastness of time and the mystery of creation. The laboratory and the seance were not opposites, but twin expressions of a deeper longing, to know where we come from, and what it means to be human in an ever-widening universe. By the century's end, that longing turned its gaze toward the sea. New instruments, dredging equipment, deep-sea cables, and early bathymetric maps began to reveal the ocean floor as a landscape of mountains and valleys. Some believe these findings confirmed Donnelly's vision. Others dismissed the idea entirely. But one thing was clear. The myth of Atlantis had migrated once more from the pages of philosophy and mysticism into the language of science. It no longer mattered whether the island had ever existed. What mattered was what it represented: the eternal human wish to unite knowledge and wonder, reason and reverence. In the twilight of reason and imagination, Atlantis became the bridge no science could yet cross. And as the century turned, the dream of Atlantis began to move again, this time beneath the sea itself. The close of the 19th century ushered in a new kind of adventure, one that did not look to the stars or the ends of the earth, but downward into the quiet depths of the sea. Humanity had mapped continents and measured mountains, Yet beneath the waves lay an entire world still untouched by the light of knowledge. The ocean was, to the Victorians, both a mystery and a promise, a final frontier, vast and unseen, perhaps still holding the memory of worlds long vanished. For centuries, the ocean floor had been imagined rather than known. Ancient mariners believed it was filled with monsters, abysses without end. Even in the Enlightenment, few dared to imagine what truly lay below. But by the mid-1800s, a new curiosity emerged, a scientific hunger to measure, to map, to understand. The same spirit that had driven explorers across the globe now turned inward and downward, into the blue vastness beneath every horizon. The invention of the telegraph cable changed everything. To lay lines across the Atlantic, engineers first had to study the seabed. They dropped weighted lines into the water, letting them fall for hours, sometimes days, measuring depth by the length of cable unwound. What came back was astonishing, a detailed portrait of the deep. Ridges, valleys, and plateaus seemed to rise from the dark. One such elevation, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, appeared to run almost exactly where ancient maps had placed Atlantis. The discovery sent ripples through both science and imagination alike. Calmly, the narrator invites the listener to picture those early expeditions. Men standing on the decks of wooden ships, instruments in hand, their faces lit by lantern light and the silver shimmer of the moon. Every sounding line pulled from the depths carried a whisper of mystery. The ocean, once endless and featureless, was now a landscape, silent, hidden, and perhaps ancient. When the HMS Challenger expedition set sail in 1872, it marked the true birth of oceanography. Over 4 years, the crew traveled nearly 70,000 nautical miles, collecting samples, charting depths, and revealing a new dimension of the planet. They discovered deep-sea life thriving where no one believed it could, and vast plains of sediment that spoke of time measured not in centuries, but in millions of years. For the scientific world, it was a revelation. For the dreamers, it was confirmation that the deep did, indeed, hold forgotten worlds. Not all discoveries were met with certainty. In 1898, explorers mapping the ocean floor reported strange formations, submerged plateaus, and volcanic peaks in the mid-Atlantic. Some claimed these were the last remains of Atlantis, swallowed by the sea. The newspapers of the age, hungry for wonder, eagerly printed such stories. The legend, dormant for centuries, stirred once again. Scientists urged caution, explaining these were natural features of the ocean crust, but the timing was too perfect. In an era of invention and rediscovery, the myth fit the mood. It was an age when the boundary between myth and science blurred in fascination, not conflict. Each new instrument, each new map, seemed to whisper of something just beyond reach, as if progress itself were leading humanity back to its forgotten beginnings. Even submarine inventors, working on the first experimental craft, spoke of exploring the deep not only for military or practical purpose, but for the romance of discovery. The early submarines were fragile, awkward machines, more dream than vessel. Yet their creators, like Simon Lake and Jules Verne's fictional Captain Nemo, imagined them as keys to an invisible kingdom. The hum of gears, the creak of metal under pressure, and the silence outside the glass. These became part of a new human experience. Beneath the waves, one could feel both the immensity of nature and the intimacy of mystery. As exploration deepened, so too did speculation. In 1912, the discovery of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge's volcanic nature reignited Atlantis theories. Writers like William Scott Elliott and later Lewis Spence linked geological findings to ancient flood myths. They described entire continents slowly sinking, their peaks remaining as islands, echoes, perhaps, of a once great land now lost. These ideas found eager audiences, not because they were proven, but because they felt poetic. The earth itself seemed to be telling the same story Plato had begun, one of creation, destruction, and memory. The calm narration reflects here. Science did not confirm Atlantis, but it gave it new form. For the first time, humanity could imagine the ocean not as an empty void, but as a keeper of time, preserving fragments of its own forgotten story beneath layers of pressure and darkness. Meanwhile, on the surface, the world itself was changing. The 20th century dawned with invention and upheaval: airplanes, automobiles, wars, and the hum of electricity. Yet beneath all this noise, the ocean remained the same: vast, slow, and silent. Explorers still gazed into its depths, drawn by the same quiet yearning that had led philosophers, mystics, and poets before them. It was during this era that technology began to merge with myth once again. The newly emerging field of sonar allowed ships to see the seafloor through sound. As waves echoed back, they painted unseen landscapes in lines of light and shadow. To some, these patterns resembled walls or steps, perhaps the architecture of a sunken world. To others, they were simply the raw beauty of the Earth's geology, misunderstood but no less mesmerizing. In truth, both were right in their own way. Atlantis, whether as history or metaphor, had always been a reflection of what humanity most desired: proof that meaning runs deeper than measurement, that even in the cold geometry of science, there is room for wonder. Each descent into the deep was not just a search for ruins, but for reassurance that the past still speaks. And so, the story of Atlantis moved forward once more, carried not by myth alone, but by machines and minds that reached into the ocean's heart. What they found was not a city, but a silence, ancient, vast, and alive with possibility. As machines illuminated the ocean's darkness, the myth of Atlantis, too, found a new light in the modern age. The 20th century dawned not with myth, but with measurement. The telescopes, laboratories, and universities of the new age no longer looked for proof of the fantastic. They sought the structure of the real. Yet, in doing so, they uncovered a world so dynamic, so alive beneath its calm surface, that even ancient legends seemed to echo faintly in its discovery. The Earth, once imagined as fixed and eternal, revealed itself to be restless, breathing, drifting, alive. In the early decades of the century, scientists began to see the planet not as a still sphere, but as a moving puzzle of colossal plates. Beneath the crust, heat and pressure slowly shaped continents and oceans alike. This idea, plate tectonics, would transform every field of geology. The continents, it seemed, were not isolated fragments, but fragments of a larger story, once connected, then separated by time and tide. The world was not static, but in motion. For the first time, it became clear that the sea could give and take entire worlds. Islands could rise from volcanic birth, only to sink again beneath the waves. Coasts could drown, and mountain ranges could once have lain under shallow seas. The boundaries between land and ocean were not eternal. They were temporary arrangements of stone. And in this truth, the dream of Atlantis found a quiet kind of vindication, not literal, but poetic. Calmly, the narration drifts through the hum of research ships and laboratories. In the 1950s and 60s, scientists aboard vessels like the Glomar Challenger began mapping the ocean floor in detail. Their instruments traced vast undersea ridges, most famously the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, and discovered patterns of magnetic reversal in the rocks, showing how new crust formed and spread outward from the Earth's molten core. The ocean floor was not a graveyard, but a living record of creation itself. For centuries, the myth of Atlantis had imagined a world lost to the sea. Now science showed that such transformations were not mythic, but inevitable. Continents drifted. Oceans opened and closed. Whole regions had once lain above water, only to sink beneath it again over millions of years. The Earth, it seemed, was perfectly capable of swallowing and remaking its own surface, though not in the span of a single catastrophe, but through the slow, patient pulse of geological time. And yet, even as science refuted the literal possibility of a mid-Atlantic continent, the metaphor of Atlantis endured. To geologists, the planet itself had become a storyteller, whispering of the ancient, the lost, and the ever-changing. To philosophers and poets, Atlantis no longer belonged to geography, it belonged to the imagination. It symbolized not a place, but a principle, that all things, even civilizations, are temporary expressions of the world's greater rhythm. This was also the age of the deep-sea revolution. Submersibles like Bathyscaphe Trieste and later Alvin descended into the ocean's blackest depths. What they found was beyond imagining. Creatures glowing like stars, mountain chains as vast as continents, vents that breathed heat and minerals into the water like undersea volcanoes. The ocean floor was not barren but teeming with strange life, thriving in darkness. Each discovery seemed to whisper the same quiet truth: the world still held secrets. Atlantis had not been found, but the sense of wonder it represented had been renewed. Humanity, in seeking to disprove the myth, had stumbled upon something even greater: the living majesty of the planet itself. The calm narration lingers here, in the laboratories where data glows softly on screens, in the gentle hum of sonar pings through the deep. Each signal returned from the darkness below is both knowledge and echo, reminding us that mystery and science are not opposites, but partners. The myth of Atlantis no longer belongs to superstition. It belongs to reflection. It teaches that truth, too, can evolve, that what we lose in legend, we regain in understanding. By the late 20th century, geologists and historians alike had reached a quiet consensus. There was no missing continent, no sunken empire in the mid-Atlantic. But the story itself had taken root in another soil, that of psychology, art, and collective imagination. Atlantis had become a metaphor for human progress, for the rise and fall of cultures, for the cycles of creation and collapse that define our shared history. Even scientists, when asked about the legend, often responded with a kind of gentle reverence. They knew the continents had shifted, that seas had drowned coastal worlds, Doggerland beneath the North Sea, Sundaland beneath the Indian Ocean, and ancient settlements now lying beneath the Mediterranean. These were not Atlantis, but they were real echoes, small reminders that the boundary between myth and memory is never entirely firm. And so, while the philosopher's island remained unfound, its essence persisted in new form. It lived in the language of ecology, in the awareness of a fragile planet, in the understanding that all civilizations, like continents, are impermanent. Atlantis had become a mirror through which humanity could see itself, proud, creative, and yet always vulnerable to the forces it cannot control. The Earth proved more alive than legend, and yet Atlantis still endured. Because in every discovery, every sonar map, every shifting plate, every coastline swallowed by time, the old story remained. Not as proof, but as poetry. Not as evidence, but as meaning. Atlantis, once imagined as a place lost to the sea, had become something far deeper, a symbol of the Earth's eternal dance between creation and loss. And as science redrew the world's maps, the dream of Atlantis continued, now in stories, screens, and song. When the world no longer believed in Atlantis, storytellers dreamed it anew. The 20th century, an age of invention, anxiety, and wonder, gave Atlantis a second life, not through discovery, but through imagination. As science stripped away the illusion of a sunken continent, writers, poets, and filmmakers quietly rebuilt it in story and symbol. No longer a place upon the map, Atlantis became a mirror of longing, a reflection of what humanity missed, or feared, or hoped to recover. In the early decades of the century, pulp fiction and early science fiction seized upon the legend with vivid energy. Magazines printed tales of undersea kingdoms, crystal technologies, and civilizations preserved beneath domes of glass. These were not scholarly Atlanteans, but dreamers, heirs of lost wisdom who survived the flood of time. In their world, Atlantis was the prototype for the modern myth of the hidden world, the idea that somewhere, beneath the surface, something ancient and unbroken still waited to be found. Writers like Jules Verne and later H.P. Lovecraft approached the theme from different shores. Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea painted a vision of underwater exploration that echoed Plato's sense of grandeur and fall, Captain Nemo as both conqueror and exile of the modern age. Lovecraft, in his shadowed cosmology, turned Atlantis into something darker, a warning of civilizations that tampered with forces beyond their understanding. Even in fear, the myth endured. The calm narration lingers on this paradox, that Atlantis could mean so many things, paradise to some, apocalypse to others, yet always spoke to the same quiet yearning. Beneath every retelling lay the same heartbeat, the desire to connect with something greater, something ancient that modern life had forgotten. By mid-century, Atlantis moved from the pages of speculative fiction into the language of cinema. The silver screen gave the legend color, movement, and sound, the shimmer of light through water, the slow descent into the unknown. Films such as Journey to the Center of the Earth, 1959, Warlords of Atlantis, 1978, and even the animated Atlantis, The Lost Empire, 2001, transformed the myth into a visual symphony of exploration and rediscovery. Each adaptation reflected its own era, post-war wonder, Cold War curiosity, or millennial nostalgia, yet all returned to the same central image, a civilization lost, but not forgotten. Disney's Atlantis, The Lost Empire perhaps captured the modern heart of the myth most gently. Released in 2001, it told not of conquest or warning, but of rediscovery, the idea that Atlantis had survived in silence, waiting for humanity to listen again. Its world was filled with light and memory, its people bound not by ambition but by wisdom. The film's tone, adventurous yet compassionate, mirrored the century's quiet evolution of belief, from hubris to humility, from domination to preservation. In literature, meanwhile, Atlantis evolved into a metaphor for cultural nostalgia. Aldous Huxley, in his 1962 novel Island, inverted the legend entirely, creating a utopia found rather than lost, suggesting that humanity's greatest dream was not recovery, but renewal. In contrast, authors like Arthur C. Clarke and Ursula K. Le Guin invoked the myth to explore questions of memory, loss, and the fragile balance between progress and peace. The Lost World became a symbol of what modern civilization risked losing in its own pursuit of perfection. The calm tone deepens here, imagining the reader or listener in a quiet room, surrounded by the soft glow of screens or books. Across a century of art, the myth of Atlantis has become a kind of shared lullaby, a story retold not for its truth, but for its beauty. Whether drawn as a shining city, a submerged ruin, or a metaphor for the human spirit, Atlantis serves the same purpose it did in Plato's dialogues, to remind us that knowledge and virtue must rise together, or not at all. Even in the surreal worlds of modern fantasy and animation, the myth persists. Atlantis appears in superhero films, science fiction sagas, and animated universes, each retelling emphasizing a different aspect of human hope. Sometimes it is a refuge, sometimes a warning, sometimes a mirror of ecological loss. In all forms, it speaks of a balance that once existed between humanity and nature, mind and spirit, and that might one day exist again. There is comfort in this persistence. Myths do not vanish when disproven. They evolve, like the continents themselves. Atlantis, once thought to lie somewhere in the Atlantic, now exists within the collective imagination, a floating island of meaning carried forward by every generation that dreams of a better past. In the soft flicker of film reels and the rhythm of turning pages, the legend endures, reshaped yet eternal. And in this endurance lies a subtle truth, that stories, like civilizations, survive not through certainty, but through remembrance. We return to Atlantis not to find it, but to feel the shape of what it meant: unity, wisdom, and the fragile beauty of all things that can be lost. When the world no longer believed in Atlantis, storytellers dreamed it anew. And in their dreaming, they gave it life once more, a life measured not in ruins or relics, but in imagination and art. But beyond books and screens, others sought Atlantis once more, not as fantasy, but as prophecy. Perhaps the lost city was never beneath the waves, but within us all along. As the 20th century drew to a close, the world entered a new kind of search, not for continents or ruins, but for meaning. The myth of Atlantis, once a philosopher's warning and later a scientist's curiosity, began to shimmer again in the language of the soul. It found its way into the gentle currents of New Age spirituality, where seekers spoke not of sunken cities, but of inner awakenings. In quiet meditation circles, in the soft hum of crystal shops, in books lined with words like vibration, awakening, and ascension, Atlantis became something different, not a place, but a state of consciousness. The calm narration drifts through this transformation, not to question or to prove, but simply to observe how an ancient story became a mirror for the modern heart. Figures like Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet of the early 20th century, had already begun this reimagining. In deep trance, he spoke of Atlantis as a civilization of immense knowledge and spiritual power, one that fell through pride, yet whose souls had returned, reborn in modern times to heal what was once broken. His readings, though controversial, struck a quiet chord in millions who longed to believe that humanity's story was cyclical, that we were not beginning anew, but remembering what was once forgotten. By the 1970s and 80s, the New Age movement carried this vision forward. Atlantis was no longer a lost empire beneath the sea, but a symbol of higher awareness, of unity between science and spirit, earth and cosmos. Authors like Shirley MacLaine, Helena Blavatsky, and later, channelers and healers across the world, spoke of the Atlantean consciousness, the idea that within each person lies the same divine spark that once illuminated that fabled world. To many, these teachings offered a kind of gentle hope. In an age marked by environmental loss, technological overwhelm, and spiritual uncertainty, Atlantis represented something enduring, a memory of balance. The myth whispered of a time when humanity lived in harmony with the earth, when knowledge was sacred and the natural world was not conquered, but cherished. Even if that world never truly existed, the yearning for it did, and in that yearning lay its truth. The narration lingers, soft and reflective, on why such myths return when they do. Atlantis rises whenever the world feels unmoored, when modern life grows too loud, too divided, too fast. It reappears as a metaphor for unity, a quiet voice reminding us that wisdom without compassion leads to ruin, and that enlightenment, like a lost shore, must be rediscovered again and again. In guided meditations, spiritual texts, and quiet retreats, Atlantis became a language of memory. Some envisioned it as a realm of light, an ethereal frequency beyond our perception. Others saw it as the collective subconscious, the deep ocean of shared human experience. There was no single version, no agreed geography, but that was precisely its beauty. Atlantis had become the ultimate spiritual symbol, fluid, inclusive, and reflective, able to hold whatever meaning each seeker brought to it. It also became intertwined with other cosmic and mystical ideas. Lemuria, the age of Aquarius, the awakening of planetary energy grids. Some believed that ancient crystals carried remnants of Atlantean energy. Others felt that global consciousness itself was shifting toward a return of that forgotten wisdom. Whether metaphor or mystery, these stories offered a kind of peaceful assurance that history was not a straight descent into chaos, but a vast, circular tide of forgetting and remembering. And perhaps that is why the myth endures so deeply. Atlantis is, at its heart, a story about fall and renewal, the endless rhythm of creation, loss, and rediscovery that defines the human condition. It comforts us because it reflects our own cycles of transformation, our mistakes, our awakenings, our quiet returns to what we value most. In the soft stillness of night, the story feels less like fantasy and more like meditation. Whether one believes in the literal island or the symbolic one within, the message is the same, that wisdom, once lost, can be found again, not by diving into oceans, but by listening inward. The calm voice lingers on this closing reflection. Atlantis, reborn in the language of the New Age, became more than myth. It became a practice of remembering. A call not to search the seas, but to tend to the inner tides of compassion, balance, and awareness. And so, the tides of belief turned once again toward the question that has always remained. What truth lies beneath the legend? Could the myth of Atlantis have been born from a real island that burned and fell beneath the sea? In the quiet dawn of the 20th century, a man stood amid the windswept hills of Crete, brushing centuries of dust from stone. His name was Sir Arthur Evans, and beneath his hands, the buried city of Knossos began to rise once more into the light. It was not a tale from myth, but from earth, and yet, as walls and frescoes emerged, shimmering with color and grace, whispers of Atlantis stirred again. Evans had found something extraordinary. Beneath layers of soil lay the remnants of a civilization older than classical Greece, older even than Homer's heroes. Its palaces were vast, its artistry elegant. Dolphins danced across walls, labyrinths twisted through courtyards, and fine ceramics spoke of trade and wealth. This was the Minoan civilization, named after the legendary King Minos. But to many, its beauty, brilliance, and mysterious end seemed too familiar, too hauntingly close to Plato's tale. The calm voice of the narrator drifts like sea air across the ruins. Plato had written that Atlantis was an island beyond the Pillars of Heracles, a power that once ruled the seas, radiant and proud, until it fell in a single day and night of fire and flood. And here, among the islands of the Aegean, lay a civilization that had indeed fallen to fire and sea. Around 1600 BCE, the nearby island of Thera, now called Santorini, erupted in one of the greatest volcanic explosions in recorded history. The eruption shattered the island, sending ash across the sky and waves across the sea. Entire settlements vanished. Crops failed. The Minoan ports were struck by tsunamis that reached Crete's northern coast. The quiet hum of life on the island changed forever. Archaeologists believe this catastrophe may have marked the beginning of the Minoans' decline, a civilization undone not by conquest, but by the earth itself. It is here, in this intersection of story and soil, that the myth of Atlantis seems to shimmer most clearly. For centuries, scholars and dreamers alike have wondered whether Plato's Atlantis was inspired by memories of the Minoans, passed down through generations of Greek storytelling. Perhaps sailors, poets, and philosophers retold fragments of truth, a mighty island that prospered, worshipped the sea, and fell beneath its power. But the calm narrative does not rush to claim revelation. It pauses, inviting reflection. Perhaps the connection between Atlantis and the Minoans is not a matter of evidence, but of emotion. Myths often arise from the places where memory meets loss. The Minoan ruins, with their bright frescoes and silent corridors, awaken that same longing Plato wrote of, for a world that was once whole and is now gone. Visitors to Knossos often describe the site as dreamlike. The stairways lead nowhere. The painted columns rise toward the sky like remnants of thought. In the gentle silence of the Aegean, one can almost imagine the hum of ancient music, the flicker of light on polished floors. It feels less like archaeology and more like remembrance, as though the earth itself still remembers what the waves took away. Modern scholars, of course, approach the question with care. The Minoans were real, a people with written scripts, art, and architecture. Atlantis, as far as evidence shows, was not. Yet both share something deeper than fact, a pattern. The rise and fall of civilizations, the fragility of prosperity, the eternal rhythm of creation and collapse. These themes echo through every age. Perhaps that is why the Atlantis legend found such resonance in the story of the Minoans, because both remind us that even the brightest worlds can vanish in an instant. As the narration continues, it drifts to the island of Santorini, where the cliffs rise like broken amphitheaters around a sea-filled caldera. Scientists study the layers of volcanic ash, tracing the moment when the world changed. The Minoan town of Akrotiri, preserved beneath ash like a Bronze Age Pompeii, tells of life frozen mid-motion, frescoes of lilies and swallows, pottery still on tables, staircases leading to upper floors long gone. It is haunting, but serene, destruction preserved in beauty. And so, when modern explorers speak of Atlantis, it is often Santorini they imagine, not because it fits every word of Plato's account, but because it feels true in the way that all enduring myths do. It captures the essence of loss and renewal, a paradise undone by nature's hand, yet never completely forgotten. The calm voice lingers on one thought. Perhaps the myth of Atlantis is not a mystery to be solved, but a memory to be honored. The Minoans remind us that what lies beneath the waves is not always fantasy. Sometimes, it is history itself, softened by time, transformed by imagination. As the Minoan palaces crumbled into legend, new discoveries across the world began to whisper the same ancient story, that every continent, every sea, holds its own echo of Atlantis. When the sea swallowed Thera, did memory reshape disaster into myth? Far to the south of Greece, where the Aegean gleams like glass beneath the sun, lies the island of Santorini, a crescent of white cliffs surrounding a calm blue caldera. It is one of the most beautiful places on Earth. Yet beneath its serenity lies the memory of a cataclysm that once changed the world. In ancient times, this island was known as Thera, and nearly 3,600 years ago, it was the heart of one of the most powerful volcanic eruptions in human history. The calm narration begins not with fire, but with life. Before the eruption, Thera was home to a thriving Minoan settlement, the city of Akrotiri. Its streets were paved, its houses adorned with frescoes of dolphins, lilies, and swallows. The people traded with Crete and Egypt, sailing across seas that shimmered with promise. It was a place of light and color, of artistry and order. For centuries, it slept beneath the ash, perfectly preserved, a ghost city sealed in silence. Then, one day, the earth trembled. The volcano beneath Thera awoke with unimaginable force. First came the earthquakes, then the ash, and finally the eruption itself, a storm of fire that tore the island apart. The center of Thera collapsed into the sea, leaving behind the great ring of cliffs we see today. The skies darkened for months, perhaps years. Ash fell over distant lands, and waves surged across the Aegean, reaching even the coasts of Crete. The world, for a moment, seemed to end. As centuries passed, the story of that devastation may have drifted across generations, reshaped by memory, told by sailors, poets, and philosophers. By the time Plato wrote his dialogues nearly 1,000 years later, could the memory of Thera have become Atlantis, a once great island swallowed by the sea in a single day and night? The narrator does not claim it as truth, but offers it as reflection. Myths are often born not from invention, but remembrance. The Thera eruption was not a single tragedy. It was a wound in the world's memory, shared through story. The images Plato described, the circular island, the bright harbors, the temples gleaming with metal and marble, seemed to echo the geography of Santorini itself. And the ending, sudden and cataclysmic, feels less like imagination and more like memory turned poetic. Archaeologists who walk the streets of Akrotiri describe it as eerily peaceful. Pots rest on shelves, stairways climb to upper rooms long gone, and painted dolphins leap across the walls as if still alive. There are no bodies, only absence. Perhaps the people escaped in time, carrying their memories of the island's fall to other shores. Those memories, passed down in fragments and songs, could have reached the Greek world centuries later, transformed, softened, and sanctified into the legend of Atlantis. The calm voice guides listeners through a meditation on time. Nature's forces, so vast, so indifferent, often become the canvas for human meaning. The eruption of Thera was not only geological, it was existential. It reminded humankind that creation and destruction are one continuous breath. And so, even in its violence, it gave birth to a myth that has endured for millennia, a story not of ruin alone, but of remembrance. Today, Santorini's cliffs stand as both monument and mirror. Tourists walk the winding paths of Oje, gazing over the deep blue waters that now fill the volcano's heart. Few realize they are looking upon the scar of a story older than their cities, older than their languages. Beneath the calm sea lies the echo of the eruption, a silence that speaks of how civilizations rise, fall, and are reborn through the telling. And so, when we hear of Atlantis, of a golden city beneath the waves, perhaps it is Thera we truly remember. A real island, a real people, and a real moment when the earth itself rewrote history. The myth of Atlantis may have been born not in fantasy, but in the echo of this island's voice, the whisper of fire and sea preserved in human memory. And beyond the Aegean, other ruins, far older, far stranger, called to those who still believe the ocean hid humanity's forgotten dawn. Across oceans and ages, the same story unfolds, of greatness, of loss, and of remembrance. In the gentle rhythm of centuries, humanity has always sought connection, threads between the known and the forgotten. As the 19th century unfolded, that search turned westward, toward the vast lands of the Americas. There, beneath the thick jungles of Central America and across the high plains of Mexico, explorers unearthed temples and cities whose beauty rivaled anything in the Old World. And in the quiet awe of those discoveries, some whispered, "Could this be Atlantis reborn?" The narrator speaks softly of the age of exploration and curiosity, an era when archaeologists, missionaries, and dreamers alike wandered through overgrown ruins, sketching stone faces and measuring crumbling pyramids. They found civilizations, the Maya, the Aztecs, the Olmecs, whose art and mathematics, calendars and architecture seemed impossibly advanced. To the Victorian imagination, raised on the story of Plato's lost world, the temptation was irresistible. These were the descendants of Atlantis, they said, survivors who had crossed the sea long ago. In calm reflection, the narration reminds the listener that such theories were not born of malice, but of longing. The 19th century was an age of maps and mysteries, of wonder colliding with the limits of understanding. Scholars like Ignatius Donnelly and early antiquarians sought unity in a fractured world, a single origin for all human greatness. Atlantis, in this sense, was not just a lost island. It was a bridge, connecting continents through shared imagination. Yet, as modern archaeology matured, the truth grew clearer and more beautiful. The civilizations of the Americas were not echoes of a vanished Europe, but voices entirely their own. The Maya built observatories that tracked the heavens with astonishing precision. The Aztecs carved cities from stone and raised temples that touched the sky. The Inca wove empires through mountain ranges and memory. Each was a world complete, born from its own soil, guided by its own stars. The calm voice lingers on this revelation, that human brilliance does not need a single birthplace. The myth of Atlantis once offered unity through sameness, but the real world offers something greater, unity through diversity. From the carved faces of Copan to the silent stones of Machu Picchu, from the deserts of Egypt to the islands of the Aegean, the same pulse of creation and collapse beats softly beneath it all. Civilizations rise not once, but endlessly, wherever humans dream. Still, the myth endures, not as history, but as metaphor. When people in the 19th century looked upon the ruins of the Maya, they were not just seeking Atlantis, they were seeking themselves. They wanted assurance that all human stories were connected, that greatness could return, that the fall of one world gave rise to another. In that sense, the legend of Atlantis became a mirror of continuity, a reflection of humanity's unbroken desire to find meaning in the patterns of time. As the narration slows, it guides listeners through the hush of a tropical dusk. Cicadas sing in the ruins of Palenque. Light fades across the stepped pyramids of Teotihuacan. The air feels heavy, as if filled with memory. There, in the stillness, the myth of Atlantis seems unnecessary. These civilizations speak for themselves, voices not borrowed from the sea, but born of the earth. And so the story turns once more toward understanding. Modern archaeology replaced speculation not by dismissing mystery, but by deepening it, revealing that every corner of the world holds its own Atlantis, its own cycle of brilliance and loss. What connects us is not a single island beneath the waves, but a shared rhythm, the rise of cities, the fall of empires, and the enduring will to remember. As evidence replaced speculation, the myth of Atlantis began to transform, from a place once lost to an idea forever found. What if Atlantis was never lost, because it was never meant to be found? As the waves of time recede, we return to where the story first began, with Plato seated among his students in the shaded courtyards of Athens. His tale of Atlantis, told through the voices of Timaeus and Critias, was not meant as history, nor as prophecy. It was, at its heart, a lesson, a reflection on human nature, painted upon a vast and imaginary canvas. The calm narration invites listeners to rest here, not in the search for a place, but in the quiet understanding of a message meant to endure long after the storyteller was gone. Plato's world was one of uncertainty and change. Athens, still proud from its victories yet scarred by its wars, had tasted both glory and ruin. In the halls of the academy, philosophers pondered not how empires were built, but why they fell. And so, in his myth of Atlantis, a great and noble island that forgot its virtue and drowned beneath the weight of its pride, Plato offered a mirror to his own civilization. It was a story of hubris, of how power without wisdom turns brilliance into blindness. In this light, Atlantis becomes more than a lost city. It becomes a parable. Its temples and golden walls are symbols, not of forgotten technology, but of human ambition. The calm voice describes them as shimmering illusions, perfect order corrupted by greed, divine gifts wasted in pursuit of dominion. For Plato, the sea that swallowed Atlantis was not an act of wrath, but of balance, the world restoring harmony where pride had grown too heavy. The narrator lingers softly on this theme, as though tracing ripples across still water. Every civilization, every individual, faces the same temptation, to believe that greatness makes one invulnerable. Yet history, again and again, whispers otherwise. From Babylon to Rome, from the Maya to the modern age, the pattern repeats: creation, triumph, excess, and fall. The myth of Atlantis endures not because it tells us where something was lost, but because it reminds us how it is lost. And still, there is gentleness in the lesson. Plato did not write to condemn humanity, but to awaken it. The fall of Atlantis is tragic, yes, but it is also restorative. Through loss, humility returns. Through destruction, renewal begins. The calm narration likens it to the rhythm of the tide: retreat and return, fall and rise, the eternal breath of creation itself. The myth becomes less a warning of doom and more a meditation on balance, the same balance the ancients saw in the turning of the stars and the seasons. Listeners are invited to consider, perhaps Atlantis was never a story about others, but about us. It speaks to the quiet spaces within, the places where we build, overreach, crumble, and rebuild again. Just as the sea covers what was once proud land, time covers our moments of arrogance and error, softening them into wisdom. The myth endures because it feels both distant and deeply familiar, like an old dream we cannot quite remember, yet know we have dreamed before. The narration slows, warm and reflective. The myth of Atlantis, then, is not about punishment, but perspective. It reminds us that civilizations, and the people within them, are fragile threads in a larger tapestry. When woven with care, they create beauty. When pulled by greed or pride, they unravel. And yet, even in unraveling, something new may be born. And so, in the hush between myth and meaning, Atlantis becomes eternal. Not as a place beneath the waves, but as a truth floating gently on them, that to rise wisely, one must also remember how to fall. And yet, every fall contains within it a seed, the quiet promise of rebirth. Every empire is an island, and every island, one day, returns to the sea. The story of Atlantis, though ancient, has echoed through every age that followed. Its rhythm, rise, flourish, fall, became a pattern the world would live again and again. As the calm narration unfolds, the listener drifts through the corridors of time, past marble columns and crumbling walls, through the dust of once great cities now overgrown with grass and silence. In the beginning, there was Rome, the eternal city. Its legions marched across continents. Its language shaped the Western mind. Its monuments kissed the sun. But even Rome, for all its might, could not escape the slow turning of the tide. The narrator's voice moves softly, describing how the marble cracked, the libraries burned, and the voices of emperors were swallowed by centuries of wind. To many, Rome was a new Atlantis, a civilization that soared too high and forgot that power, without restraint, carries the seeds of its own undoing. From Rome's ashes rose others: Byzantium, the Ottomans, the British Empire, each believing their dominion would endure, each building with the confidence of immortality. And yet, time proved otherwise. The calm voice paints images of stone bridges sinking into moss, shipyards turned to rust, and maps redrawn until only the rivers remain the same. Empires, the narration reminds us, are not destroyed by time alone, but by the illusions they weave around themselves. The empire believes it is eternal. The truth is, eternity belongs only to the earth. Gentle reflections follow, not of condemnation, but of understanding. For every empire that fell, something beautiful remained. Rome left its roads and its language. The British Empire, its literature and science. The Ottomans, their architecture and art. Each empire, like Atlantis, was not truly lost, it transformed. The calm tone assures the listener that even in ruin, there is continuity. In endings, there are beginnings waiting quietly beneath the dust. The narration moves across the oceans to the modern world. Skyscrapers pierce the clouds where temples once stood. Satellites orbit where philosophers once dreamed of perfect spheres. Humanity has never stopped building, never stopped reaching. Yet, the same question Plato posed lingers in the still air. How high can we rise before we forget the ground beneath us? The imagery softens. The ruins of past empires lie quiet, half buried in sand and ivy, their shapes blurred by the breath of centuries. In them, we see not failure, but rhythm, the same rhythm found in the sea's retreat and return. It is the cycle of creation itself. Every city, every nation, every dream is part of this gentle dance between permanence and impermanence. The calm voice continues, meditative and low. Perhaps the true legacy of empire is not what it builds, but what it teaches. The fall of one power gives rise to another, each learning, sometimes painfully, that the world cannot be owned, only shared for a while. The lesson of Atlantis becomes a whisper that travels through time, reminding us to hold greatness with humility and to build knowing that one day, the sea will take back what we have made. We are all, in some way, children of lost empires. Our architecture, our languages, our systems of thought, all are fragments of what came before. The calm narration invites reflection. When we walk through a city street, we walk through layers of time. Beneath our feet are the bones of ancient worlds, the memories of forgotten kings, the echoes of laughter from marketplaces long gone. And above us, new empires rise, built on the same dreams, bound for the same fate. Yet there is beauty in this impermanence. The story of Atlantis, mirrored in every fallen empire, teaches us that loss is not the end, but part of a greater harmony. Like the tide, civilizations ebb so others may flow. The ruins we mourn are the soil from which new worlds grow. The voice softens further, a tone of peace in its melancholy. One day, even the cities we know, their towers, their lights, their names, will fade. Nature will reclaim them as it always has, gently, patiently. Grass will grow through concrete. Wind will whisper through glassless frames. The sea will rise, and the stars will reflect once more upon silent waters. And in that stillness, perhaps, the story of Atlantis will begin again, retold by whatever hearts inherit the earth next. Not as tragedy, but as memory. Not as warning, but as wisdom. For every empire is an island, and every island, one day, returns to the sea. As the lesson of Atlantis deepened, its meaning expanded from nations to the inner world of the soul. Perhaps the fall of Atlantis is not a story of the sea, but of the soul. The voice softens, not as a teacher now, but as a companion, guiding the listener inward. Atlantis, once an island of marble and gold, becomes something smaller, gentler, more human. It is the part of us that once shone brightly, that believed itself invincible, that dreamed beyond its depth, and then, one day, found itself sinking quietly beneath the waves of time. Each of us, the narration reflects, carries within a fragment of that lost city. The unfulfilled promise, the love that faded, the dream that slipped away before it could be named. In the calm rhythm of the sea, the voice suggests that our personal ruins, the things we call mistakes or failures, are not disasters, but archaeology. Beneath them lie lessons waiting to be uncovered, stories that still breathe beneath the silence. Atlantis becomes a mirror, not of pride punished, but of the tender balance between creation and loss that defines being human. The myth was never only about an island. It was about the heart that builds its own empires, the mind that imagines perfection, and the spirit that must learn to let go. The imagery slows. Waves roll softly against unseen shores. The stars shimmer above a sleeping ocean. Each rise and fall of the tide becomes a heartbeat, steady, eternal. The voice invites stillness. When you think of what you've lost, listen to the sea. It does not grieve when it returns to the shore. It simply moves, back and forth, again and again. Atlantis, then, is not a tragedy. It is transformation. To fall is not to end, it is to change shape. To sink is not to disappear, it is to become part of something larger. The calm tone lingers on the thought that perhaps every human life is an ocean floor of forgotten cities. Moments of joy, of failure, of learning, all layered and preserved, waiting to be rediscovered with kindness. There is a quiet honesty in this reflection, that within every heart lies both the builder and the storm. We create what we love, we lose what we must, and in doing so, we understand what endures. The story of Atlantis whispers to us not to cling to perfection, but to cherish imperfection, to see beauty in what has fallen, because it is through the fall that we grow. The voice softens into near whisper. What if your Atlantis is not something to recover, but something to remember? Not as a place to return to, but as a reminder of what once made you reach toward the light. Every ruin holds its own kind of grace. Every loss carries the shape of what mattered most. As the listener drifts, the narration turns almost meditative. Imagine your own Atlantis, not as a city drowned, but as a garden beneath calm waters. There are still paths there, still echoes of laughter, still light filtering through from above. You have not lost it. You have simply learned to breathe above it. In this reflection, the fall within becomes a gentle awakening, the understanding that even in stillness, even in surrender, we are not broken. We are becoming. Like the tides that endlessly reshape the shore, we are renewed each time we rise from our own depths. And so, the myth returns to its source, not in stone or sea, but in spirit. Atlantis lives wherever memory meets forgiveness, wherever pride softens into peace. It is there in every heart that has learned to let go and still love what was. The sea continues its timeless rhythm, quiet and infinite. The narrator's final words linger like a breath before dawn. Perhaps Atlantis was never lost. Perhaps it lives in all that we've learned to accept, in every moment we've fallen, and found beauty still waiting in the depths. And as dawn begins to edge over the horizon of myth, we are left with what endures, not ruins, but remembrance. Why do we keep searching for a world that may have never existed, unless it still lives within us? The narration opens with a tone of reflection, soft and unhurried. The ocean that once held the story of Atlantis now becomes a metaphor for the mind itself, vast, deep, and full of unseen currents. Myths, the voice suggests, are not just stories about the past. They are reflections of our inner landscape, rising and sinking with the tides of human feeling. Psychologists and thinkers of the modern age began to look at Atlantis not as a mystery to be solved, but as a symbol to be understood. In the early 20th century, the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung proposed that humanity shares a collective unconscious, a deep reservoir of memory and meaning, older than any individual life. From it, archetypes emerge, patterns of thought and imagination that appear across cultures and time. The flood, the fall, the lost paradise, all speak the same emotional language. Atlantis, in this light, is one of those archetypes. It represents the yearning for wholeness, for a time before division, before forgetting. It is the dream of a golden age, when humanity was in harmony with itself and the world. In the calm narration, this becomes a kind of meditation. We search for Atlantis because, somewhere deep within, we remember what harmony once felt like. The imagery flows like thought itself, waves returning to a familiar shore. Atlantis may be a lost city, but it is also a lost feeling, of belonging, of purpose, of unity. The voice asks softly, what if every civilization that dreamed of paradise was remembering the same thing? Not a place, but a state of being. As the narration drifts, the listener is invited to see how myths function as mirrors of the soul. When we speak of worlds that vanished, we are often speaking of ourselves, of what we've outgrown, or forgotten, or long to rediscover. The fall of Atlantis becomes, psychologically, the fall from innocence into awareness, from unity into complexity. It is the moment humanity first looked at itself and realized it could destroy as easily as it could create. In this way, the myth's endurance makes perfect sense. Atlantis survives not because it was real, but because it is true, true to the rhythm of human emotion, to the quiet ache of memory that lives in all of us. Myths that endure do so because they are not just told, they are felt. The voice then reflects on modern thinkers who followed Jung's path, Joseph Campbell, Mircea Eliade, and others who saw myth as a living language. Campbell spoke of the hero's journey, the universal story of loss and return. Atlantis, in its way, is a collective hero's journey, the story of humanity falling from grace and endlessly seeking to rise again. Calmly, the narrator guides listeners to consider how this myth persists in modern form. Every time we imagine a perfect society or speak of a world before corruption, every utopia or dream of renewal, we echo Atlantis. Even science fiction worlds, from far planets to virtual realities, often retell the same ancient longing to find what was lost. The tone remains gentle, introspective, less lecture than lullaby. We build our own Atlantises, the narrator muses, in art, in technology, in love, in hope. And when they fall, we mourn them, as we always have. But each time, we begin again. The sea becomes a metaphor once more, the surface glittering, the depths calm and unseen. Beneath the conscious world lies the unconscious, vast and unknowable. Beneath the story we tell lies another story, older, deeper, and entirely our own. Atlantis, then, is not about the past at all. It is about the present, about what it means to remember that we once believed in something perfect, and to keep believing, even when perfection fades. It is the dream we inherit, and the hope we can never quite let go. As the narration begins to close, the voice offers one final reflection, soft as a tide receding into silence. Perhaps we search for Atlantis not because we hope to find it, but because the search itself reminds us who we are, beings who remember, who long, and who create meaning from what we've lost. The sea hums faintly in the background. The waves fold back into themselves. The listener is left with a sense of quiet understanding, that the lost world is not gone at all, but lives within every story, every dream, every act of wonder. And as the story turns inward, a new horizon begins to open, not of water, but of stars. The myth of Atlantis, reborn in the depths of the mind, now begins to reach outward once more. When the oceans were mapped, the imagination found new seas among the stars. As the modern age lifted its gaze from the depths of the ocean to the expanse of the cosmos, the legend of Atlantis followed. The calm narration invites listeners to drift upward, from the blue surface of Earth to the silent infinity beyond, tracing how a story born beside the Aegean came to dwell among the stars. In the 20th century, the frontiers of imagination expanded alongside science. The same curiosity that once sent explorers to the edges of the map now turned telescopes toward distant worlds. The myth of Atlantis evolved in response. No longer confined to sunken continents, it became a parable for cosmic memory, for civilizations that might have risen and vanished light years away. Writers of science fiction and speculative thought began to weave new tapestries of wonder. Some imagined Atlantis as the remnant of an ancient extraterrestrial race, a colony of beings who once guided early humanity before retreating into the sea or the heavens. Others envisioned it as a lost outpost of cosmic knowledge, destroyed not by divine wrath, but by the same forces that shape galaxies, time, entropy, and the boundless cycle of creation and collapse. The narration remains serene, never judging, but observing gently how myths adapt when humanity's sense of scale expands. Where once the ocean was infinite, now the stars became the new deep, and Atlantis, that old emblem of lost wisdom, found a new home amid constellations and nebulae. In soft detail, the script drifts through mid-century literature and thought. Erich von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods questioned whether ancient monuments could be evidence of starborn teachers. Helena Blavatsky's earlier theosophical visions had already hinted at cosmic ancestors, connecting Atlantis to celestial evolution. These ideas, though often dismissed by science, spoke to a familiar longing, the wish to believe that humanity's story is not isolated, but part of something vast and interconnected. The narrator pauses, not to affirm, but to reflect. Why does the human mind so often link the heavens and the sea, the stars and the depths? Perhaps, the voice suggests, because both awaken the same feeling, awe before the unknown. The ocean's silence and the void's expanse mirror each other, endless, humbling, full of secrets. In that symmetry, the myth of Atlantis simply changed its setting, moving from one mystery to another. Calmly, the script observes how art, film, and music joined this vision. Atlantis became a symbol of cosmic exile, the lost home of humanity, somewhere beyond memory or matter. In some tellings, it was a planet that fell, in others, a star that died, leaving Earth as its echo. Each version, in its own way, reflected a yearning not just to discover, but to belong. And perhaps that is the quiet truth beneath the fantasy. When we imagine lost worlds among the stars, we are expressing the same emotion Plato once wrote of, the desire to remember, to recover a perfection we sense but cannot grasp. Atlantis among the stars is not about extraterrestrials, but about human wonder itself, the part of us that still looks up at night and feels, for a fleeting moment, that we have come from somewhere more luminous. The tone remains soft, meditative, as the narrator drifts toward conclusion. The legend that began in the calm rooms of Athens now spans galaxies, not through proof, but through poetry. It reminds us that myth evolves with our horizons. As the telescope replaced the trireme, and the astronaut followed the explorer, the human spirit carried its stories with it, always searching for its reflection in the vastness. And so, Atlantis among the stars becomes not a theory, but a dream, a continuation of humanity's dialogue with mystery. Whether we look down into the ocean or up into the night sky, what we truly seek may be the same, to understand where we came from and what we've lost along the way. The narrator's voice lowers, steady and thoughtful. Even among the stars, we are reminded that every search, no matter how distant, leads us back to the same place, the quiet center of ourselves, where all myths begin. Perhaps the true Atlantis is wonder, and that, unlike stone, cannot sink. As centuries passed, as maps grew full and the earth gave up many of its secrets, one question endured in the quiet corners of human thought. Why does Atlantis still live? It should have faded, washed away by time, by reason, by the precision of science. Yet, even now, when we can peer into the deep oceans with satellites and trace the tectonic scars of continents long gone, the legend remains, calm, unyielding, eternal in its allure. The narration flows gently, like a tide returning to familiar shores. Atlantis, we are reminded, has survived every transformation, from Plato's moral tale to the dream of explorers, from esoteric prophecy to digital myth. It has been reborn in new languages, new sciences, and new imaginations. Its endurance is not a failure of skepticism, but a triumph of the human spirit's capacity to dream. In the stillness of reflection, the narrator invites listeners to see that Atlantis is not a deception, but a mirror. It endures because it gives shape to an emotion older than civilization itself, the feeling that there is always something more to know, something just beyond reach. The myth asks us to believe not in what is visible, but in what might be possible. Calmly, the story unfolds through images of quiet curiosity. A scholar in a dim library tracing ancient words with a fingertip, a diver suspended in the dark blue silence beneath the waves, a child, half asleep, staring at the glow of a map and wondering what lies beyond its edges. Each, in their way, continues the same search, not for a place, but for meaning. Perhaps, the narrator muses, our fascination with Atlantis is simply an act of hope. Hope that the world still holds secrets, that progress has not drained away every mystery, that beneath the rational order of things there still moves an undercurrent of awe. In this sense, the persistence of Atlantis is not about history at all, but about balance, between knowing and wondering, between discovery and dreaming. The narration lingers on the beauty of not knowing. For what would life be if all questions were answered, if every horizon were mapped? The myth reminds us that uncertainty is not an emptiness to be feared, but a space to rest in, a quiet ocean where the imagination drifts freely. Just as the sea conceals and reveals in equal measure, so too does mystery sustain the mind. Across the centuries, thinkers have tried to define Atlantis as a moral warning, a memory of disaster, a hidden truth, a poetic symbol. And yet, perhaps its greatest meaning lies in its refusal to be defined. Each era reshapes it because it cannot be contained. Its essence, like the sea, shifts and glimmers with every gaze. Softly, the narrator concludes that Atlantis survives wherever curiosity meets silence, in the gentle tension between what we know and what we feel. It is not the city that matters, nor its supposed ruins beneath the waves, but the feeling it stirs, that subtle ache for what has been lost, or what might yet be found. As the music of the sea rises faintly beneath the narration, the tone settles into stillness. The myth has endured not because it was ever proven, but because it never needed to be. It exists in the space between fact and faith, a space wide enough to dream within. And so, as the listener drifts into quiet thought, the final reflection comes like a whisper. Atlantis was never just a story of the past. It is the dream that the world still holds secrets, that somewhere, beneath the surface of understanding, wonder itself remains unsunk. Logical transition. And so, the story drifts toward its final shore, where memory meets eternity. Some stories survive not because they happened, but because they matter. As the long journey nears its end, the narration slows, steady, gentle, reflective. The sea that once raged around the legend of Atlantis now rests calm beneath a twilight sky. We have followed the story from Plato's quiet academy to the stars themselves, through centuries of discovery, doubt, and wonder. And in this stillness, we begin to see what has truly endured. Atlantis, after all, was never only a tale of stone cities or drowned continents. It was a story of humanity, of the questions we ask and the dreams we chase. Across millennia, it has been retold not as history, but as heartbeat. Each age found something new within it, moral truth for philosophers, mystery for explorers, inspiration for artists, and solace for dreamers. Calmly, the narrator traces this legacy. From the ink of Plato's dialogues to the paint of Renaissance frescoes, from the pages of Donnelly's antediluvian world to the glow of cinema screens, Atlantis has drifted like a luminous thread through the tapestry of culture. Its image changes, sometimes a cautionary ruin, sometimes a paradise, sometimes a mirror, but the thread remains unbroken. The power of this endurance lies in the myth's quiet adaptability. Where faith falters, imagination restores it. Where certainty hardens, curiosity softens its edges. Atlantis has outlasted empires and ideologies because it belongs to something more enduring than either, the human need to remember what perfection might feel like. The narration lingers on the calm irony that Plato's allegory, intended as a lesson in humility, became a canvas for limitless imagination. Yet perhaps this, too, was part of its design. A parable meant to reveal the dangers of pride became, instead, an everlasting symbol of hope. Its ruins became foundations, its fall became flight. In every era, Atlantis adapts, not to deceive, but to accompany. It moves with us, a quiet companion across time, whispering that stories need not be true to be meaningful. Even in an age of satellites and data, we still feel the pull of something ineffable, the same pull that made ancient listeners pause when Plato first spoke of an island beyond the pillars of Heracles. There is peace in this realization that myths are not abandoned when disproved. They simply evolve, shedding their literal form to reveal their deeper soul. Atlantis, then, is not gone. It lives in how we imagine progress, how we interpret ruin, how we dream of harmony. It has shaped thought subtly, inspiring poets to write of lost Edens, scientists to wonder at vanished worlds, and philosophers to question the moral tides that govern civilizations. Softly, the narrator paints a final image, a world half-lit by memory, half-shadowed by curiosity. Somewhere, a reader closes a book about Atlantis. Somewhere else, a filmmaker sketches a scene of shining towers beneath the sea. In each act of remembrance, the legend breathes again. Perhaps that is its truest legacy, not the persistence of the myth itself, but the persistence of wonder it awakens. Every retelling is a reaffirmation that humanity still dares to dream, still yearns to connect the seen and the unseen. The voice lowers, serene and sure. Atlantis endures because imagination endures. And imagination endures because, somewhere deep within us, we refuse to let go of beauty. Logical transition. And as the last wave fades, one truth remains, that we keep what we imagine. Beneath the waves lies not only what was lost, but what endures. The narration slows to a tide's rhythm. The voice is soft, the tone meditative, as if spoken from the edge of the world. The sea stretches outward, endless, dark, and gentle, and for a moment, it becomes not merely water, but memory itself. The ocean has always been the Earth's great archive. Long before we carved words into stone or pressed ink to parchment, the waves were already keeping record. Every current carries silt from distant shores. Every layer of sand tells a story of a world that once was. Beneath its surface lie the fossils of vanished creatures, the outlines of lost coastlines, and the faint, forgotten paths of rivers that once fed civilizations now erased. The ocean remembers. It remembers the heat of the world's birth, when molten rock first met vapor. It remembers the slow drift of continents, the rise and fall of ice, the hum of life learning to breathe. It remembers the thunder of ancient storms, the silence of drowned forests, the tremor of earthquakes that folded mountains and cities alike beneath its calm skin. In this stillness, the narrator invites the listener to imagine the ocean not as something that destroys, but as something that keeps. Every ruin it swallows becomes part of its living story. The sea does not erase, it preserves, reshaping what it takes into new forms of beauty. A marble column becomes coral. A sunken ship becomes a reef. Even loss becomes life again. This is where Atlantis finds its truest form, not as a single island swallowed by the sea, but as the collective memory of all that has come before. Every civilization that vanished without a trace, the Minoans, the Olmec, the Indus, the peoples of forgotten coasts, lives on within the ocean's quiet archive. Their stories drift through time, refracted in myth and rediscovered in fragments, like messages written in the language of tides. Calmly, the voice continues. Perhaps this is why the legend of Atlantis feels so eternal. It mirrors the sea's nature, vast, unknowable, yet filled with echoes. To seek Atlantis is to seek meaning within that mystery, to understand that the sea holds both the evidence of change and the promise of continuity. The narration lingers on an image, sunlight filtering through clear water, touching the sand below like memory resurfacing. Each grain beneath the waves was once mountain, forest, or bone. Every shimmer of blue carries the weight of millennia. The ocean is not a void. It is the breath between eras, the pulse that connects all life that has ever been. Science, too, finds poetry in this truth. Oceanographers map trenches that could swallow Everest, trace underwater ridges that mirror the patterns of mythic continents. Archaeologists dive to study lost ports, submerged temples, drowned valleys. Yet for all their instruments, there remains something beyond measure, a silence too vast for data, too intimate for proof. It is the feeling of standing on a shoreline and sensing that time itself has tides. The narrator's tone softens further. Perhaps the myth of Atlantis endures because, deep down, we recognize ourselves in this cycle. We are creatures of memory, always building upon what came before, always leaving traces for what comes next. Our lives, like coastlines, shift and erode in return. We, too, are part of the ocean's remembering. As the waves roll in, the soundscape of the narration slows to near stillness, the faint wash of surf, the distant hum of wind over water. The voice continues like a tide whispering to the listener's heart. The sea does not judge. It does not mourn. It simply carries on, holding everything that ever was, joy and ruin alike, in one eternal motion. In this understanding, the myth of Atlantis changes once more. It is no longer a tragedy of loss, but a hymn of continuity, the awareness that nothing truly vanishes, that even in dissolution, the world remains whole. The city that fell beneath the waves became the dream that rose within us. The ocean, then, is not only the stage upon which the story of Atlantis was set. It is the storyteller itself, speaking in waves, in silence, in the long patience of time. Every ripple is a syllable, every tide a paragraph in a story still unfolding. The narration concludes with an image of calm eternity, moonlight glimmering on water, the horizon blending into infinity. The sea, vast and ancient, breathes, not as a reminder of what has been lost, but as the quiet assurance that nothing beautiful is ever truly gone. Because beneath the waves lies not only what was lost, but what endures. Logical transition. And so, as night deepens, we return, not to ruins, but to remembrance. Atlantis may never have been found, because it was never truly lost. The narration begins with a hush, the kind that comes at the end of a long journey. The sea is calm now, the waves no longer reaching but returning. Moonlight glides across the surface, silver and slow, like the final page of a story being turned by the hand of time itself. The voice, soft, patient, speaks as though from the horizon, Atlantis. The name we have chased through centuries. The vision we have rebuilt from fragments and faith. It has been called a city, an empire, a warning, a dream. But as the echoes fade, it becomes something simpler and infinitely more profound. Atlantis is us. It is the story of humankind, of what we create, what we lose, and what we dare to imagine again. Every age, every civilization, every heart has known the rise and the fall, the hope and the forgetting. We build our worlds from sand and stone, love and thought, and the tides of time wash over them all. Yet something always remains, a trace, a whisper, a spark that begins anew. The voice drifts, like thought made into tide. Maybe that's why the story never drowned. Because the dream it carries is not bound by water or by history. It belongs to the current of human spirit, that unending rhythm between creation and return. Images unfold softly, temples beneath coral, cities glowing in twilight, a child tracing waves in the sand. All are reflections of the same truth, that to dream is to preserve. Even when the sea takes, the dream endures. It moves through time like a current beneath the surface, unseen but always there, carrying memory toward the future. Atlantis has been many things, a philosopher's warning, a poet's paradise, a seeker's hope. And yet, through all its transformations, its heart has remained constant. It reminds us to look beyond the surface, to see not only what was lost, but what still breathes beneath. It teaches humility before the vastness of nature and reverence for the fragility of what we call civilization. The narration grows stiller, the pauses between words like the slow rhythm of waves on a midnight shore. Perhaps the true gift of Atlantis was never its mystery, but its message. That no fall is final. That every ruin is the seed of renewal. That even when the world changes beyond recognition, the human longing to understand, to connect, to dream, continues like the tide itself. The sea, vast and ageless, becomes the listener's companion now. You can almost hear its heartbeat, eternal, forgiving. In it lies every forgotten story, every song that time has softened but not erased. The voice returns, quieter now. Maybe Atlantis was never about a place that vanished. Maybe it was about remembering how to begin again. The imagery swells, dawn brushing the horizon, waves turning gold, the promise of another day. The world breathes in. The myth exhales. And in the stillness between them, understanding settles like calm after storm. We are all keepers of Atlantis. Every time we rebuild after loss. Every time we choose to wonder instead of despair. The city beneath the sea is not gone. It has only changed its form, becoming memory, art, and the quiet courage to dream once more. The narration slows to its final cadence, words fading into the sound of a soft, endless ocean. Atlantis may never have been found, because it was never truly lost. It lives in the stories we tell, in the hands that create, in the eyes that look to the horizon and imagine what might be. And so, as the tide rises once more beneath the moon, the legend drifts back into the deep, not as an ending, but as a lullaby for what endures. The sea holds its breath, the stars shimmer above, and the dream sleeps, waiting, perhaps, to be dreamt again. Logical transition, and as the tides turn endlessly beneath the moon, the legend sleeps once more, waiting, perhaps, to be dreamt again.